Section 10 of the Children of Odin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. The Children of Odin, The Book of Northern Myths, by Padraic Colum. Part 2. Chapter 3. Odin wins for men the magic mead. It was the dwarfs who brewed the magic mead, and it was the giants who hid it away. But it was Odin who brought it from the place where it was hidden, and gave it to the sons of men. Those who drank of the magic mead became very wise, and not only that, but they could put their wisdom into such beautiful words that everyone who heard would love and remember it. The dwarfs brewed the magic mead through cruelty and villainy. They made it out of the blood of a man. The man was Kvasir, the poet. He had wisdom, and he had such beautiful words with it that what he said was loved and remembered by all. The dwarfs brought Kvasir down into their caverns, and they killed him there. "Now," they said, "we have Kvasir's blood and Kvasir's wisdom. No one else will have his wisdom but us." They poured the blood into 3 jars, and they mixed it with honey, and from it they brewed the magic mead. Having killed a man, the dwarfs became more and more bold. They came out of their caverns and went up and down through Midgard, the world of men. They went into Jotunheim and began to play their evil tricks on the most harmless of the giants. They came upon one giant who was very simple. Gilling was his name. They persuaded Gilling to row them out to sea in a boat. Then the 2 most cunning of the dwarfs, Galar and Fiolar, steered the boat onto a rock. The boat split. Gilling, who could not swim, was drowned. The dwarfs clambered up on pieces of the boat and came safely ashore. They were so delighted with their evil tricks that they wanted to play some more of them. Galar and Fiolar then thought of a new piece of mischief they might do. They led their band of dwarfs to Gilling's house and screamed out to his wife that Gilling was dead. The giant's wife began to weep and lament. At last she rushed out of the house weeping and clapping her hands. Now Galar and Fiolar had clambered up on the lintel of the house, and as she came running out, they cast a millstone on her head. It struck her, and Gilling's wife fell down dead. More and more the dwarfs were delighted at the destruction they were making. They were so insolent now that they made up songs and sang them, songs that were all a boast of how they had killed Kvasir the poet, and Gilling the giant, and Gilling's wife. They stayed around Jotunheim, tormenting all whom they were able to torment, and flattering themselves that they were great and strong. They stayed too long, however. Suttung, Gilling's brother, tracked them down and captured them. Suttung was not harmless and simple like Gilling his brother. He was cunning and he was covetous. Once they were in his hands, the dwarfs had no chance of making an escape. He took them and left them on a rock in the sea, a rock that the tide would cover. The giant stood up in the water taller than the rock, and the tide as it came in did not rise above his knees. He stood there watching the dwarfs as the water rose up round them, and they became more and more terrified. "Oh, take us off the rock, good Suttung," they cried out to him. "Take us off the rock, and we will give you gold and jewels. Take us off the rock, and we will give you a necklace as beautiful as Brisingamen." So they cried out to him, but the giant Suttung only laughed at them. He had no need of gold or jewels. Then Fiolar and Galar cried out, "Take us off the rock, and we will give you the jars of the magic mead we have brewed." "The magic mead," said Suttung. "This is something that no one else has. It would be well to get it, for it might help us in the battle against the gods. Yes, I will get the magic mead from them." He took the band of dwarfs off the rock, but he held Galar and Fiolar, their chiefs, while the others went into their caverns and brought up the jars of the magic mead. Suttung took the mead and brought it to a cavern in a mountain near his dwelling. And thus it happened that the magic mead, brewed by the dwarfs through cruelty and villainy, came into the hands of the giants. And the story now tells how Odin, the eldest of the gods, at that time in the world as Vegtam the Wanderer, took the magic mead out of Suttung's possession and brought it into the world of men. Now Suttung had a daughter named Gunnlod, and she by her goodness and her beauty was like Gerda and Skadi, the giant maids whom the dwellers in Asgard favoured. Suttung, that he might have a guardian for the magic mead, enchanted Gunnlod, turning her from a beautiful giant maiden into a witch with long teeth and sharp nails. He shut her into the cavern where the jars of the magic mead were hidden. Odin heard of the death of Kvasir, whom he honored above all men. The dwarfs who slew him he had closed up in their caverns, so that they were never again able to come out into the world of men. And then he set out to get the magic mead, that he might give it to men, so that, tasting it, they would have wisdom, and words would be at their command that would make wisdom loved and remembered. How Odin won the magic mead out of the rock-covered cavern where Suttung had hidden it, and how he broke the enchantment that lay upon Gunnlod, Suttung's daughter, is a story often told around the hearths of men. 9 strong thralls were mowing in a field as a wanderer went by, clad in a dark blue cloak and carrying a wanderer's staff in his hand. One of the thralls spoke to the wanderer. "Tell them in the house of Baugi up yonder that I can mow no more until a whetstone to sharpen my scythe is sent to me." "Here is a whetstone," said the wanderer, and he took one from his belt. The thrall who had spoken whetted his scythe with it and began to mow. The grass went down before his scythe as if the wind had cut it. "Give us the whetstone! Give us the whetstone!" cried the other thralls. The wanderer threw the whetstone amongst them, leaving them quarrelling over it, and went on his way. The wanderer came to the house of Baugi, the brother of Suttung. He rested in Baugi's house, and at supper-time he was given food at the great table. And while he was eating with the giant, a messenger from the field came in. "Baugi," said the messenger, "your 9 thralls are all dead. They killed each other with their scythes, fighting in the field about a whetstone. There are no thralls now to do your work." "What shall I do? What shall I do?" said Baugi the giant. "My fields will not be mown now, and I shall have no hay to feed my cattle and my horses in the winter." "I might work for you," said the wanderer. "One man's work is no use to me," said the giant. "I must have the work of 9 men." "I shall do the work of 9 men," said the wanderer. "Give me a trial and see." The next day Vegtam the wanderer went into Baugi's field. He did as much work as the 9 thralls had done in a day. "Stay with me for the season," said Baugi, "and I shall give you a full reward." So Vegtam stayed at the giant's house and worked in the giant's fields, and when all the work of the season was done, Baugi said to him, "Speak now and tell me what reward I am to give you." "The only reward I shall ask of you," said Vegtam, "is a draught of the magic mead." "The magic mead?" said Baugi. "I do not know where it is or how to get it." "Your brother Suttung has it. Go to him and claim a draught of the magic mead for me." Baugi went to Suttung, but when he heard what he had come for, the giant Suttung turned on his brother in a rage. "A draught of the magic mead?" he said. "To no one will I give a draught of the magic mead. Have I not enchanted my daughter Gunnlod so that she may watch over it? And you tell me that a wanderer who has done the work of 9 men for you asks a draught of the magic mead for his fee. O giant as foolish as Gilling! O oaf of a giant! Who could have done such work for you, and who would demand such a fee from you but one of our enemies, the Aesir? Go from me now, and never come to me again with talk of the magic mead." Baugi went back to his house, and told the wanderer that Suttung would yield none of the magic mead. "I hold you to your bargain," said Vegtam the wanderer, "and you will have to get me the fee I asked. Come with me now and help me to get it." He made Baugi bring him to the place where the magic mead was hidden. The place was a cavern in the mountain. In front of that cavern was a great mass of stone. "We cannot move that stone nor get through it," said Baugi. "I cannot help you to your fee." The wanderer drew an auger from his belt. "This will bore through the rock if there is strength behind it. You have the strength, giant. Begin now and bore." Baugi took the auger in his hands and bored with all his strength, and the wanderer stood by leaning on his staff, calm and majestic in his cloak of blue. "I have made a deep, deep hole. It goes through the rock," Baugi said at last. The wanderer went to the hole and blew into it. The dust of the rock flew back into their faces. "So that is your boasted strength, giant?" he said. "You have not bored halfway through the rock. Work again." Then Baugi took the auger again, and he bored deeper and deeper into the rock, and he blew into it, and lo, his breath went through. Then he looked at the wanderer to see what he would do. His eyes had become fierce, and he held the auger in his hand as if it were a stabbing knife. "Look up to the head of the rock," said the wanderer. As Baugi looked up, the wanderer changed himself into a snake and glided into the hole in the rock. And Baugi struck at him with the auger, hoping to kill him, but the snake slipped through. Behind the mighty rock there was a hollow place all lighted up by the shining crystals in the rock. And within the hollow place there was an ill-looking witch with long teeth and sharp nails, but she sat there rocking herself and letting tears fall from her eyes. "O youth and beauty," she sang, "O sight of men and women, sad, sad for me is it that you are shut away, and that I have only this closed-in cavern and this horrible form." A snake glided across the floor. "Oh, that you were deadly, and that you might slay me!" cried the witch. The snake glided past her. Then she heard a voice speak softly, "Gunnlod, Gunnlod." She looked round, and there, standing behind her, was a majestic man, clad in a cloak of dark blue, Odin, the eldest of the gods. "You have come to take the magic mead that my father has set me here to guard," she cried. "You shall not have it. Rather shall I spill it out on the thirsty earth of the cavern." "Gunnlod," he said, and he came to her. She looked at him, and she felt the red blood of youth come back into her cheeks. She put her hands with their sharp nails over her breast, and she felt the nails drive into her flesh. "Save me from all this ugliness," she cried. "I will save you," Odin said. He went to her. He took her hands and held them. He kissed her on the mouth. All the marks of ill favour went from her. She was no longer bent, but tall and shapely. Her eyes became wide and deep blue. Her mouth became red, and her hands soft and beautiful. She became as fair as Gerda, the giant maid whom Frey had wed. They stayed looking at each other. Then they sat down side by side and talked softly to each other. Odin, the eldest of the gods, and Gunnlod, the beautiful giant maiden. She gave him the 3 jars of the magic mead, and she told him she would go out of the cavern with him. 3 days passed, and still they were together. Then Odin by his wisdom found hidden paths and passages that led out of the cavern, and he brought Gunnlod out into the light of day. And he brought with him the jars of the magic mead, the mead whose taste gives wisdom, and wisdom in such beautiful words that all love and remember it. And Gunnlod, who had tasted a little of the magic mead, wandered through the world singing of the beauty and the might of Odin, and of her love for him. Chapter 4. Odin tells to Vidar, his silent son, the secret of his doings. It was not only to giants and men that Odin showed himself in the days when he went through Jotunheim and Midgard as Vegtam the Wanderer. He met and he spoke with the gods also, with one who lived far away from Asgard, and with others who came to Midgard and to Jotunheim. The one who lived far away from Asgard was Vidar, Odin's silent son. Far within a wilderness, with branches and tall grass growing around him, Vidar sat, and near by him a horse grazed with a saddle upon it, a horse that was ever ready for the speedy journey. And Odin, now Vegtam the Wanderer, came into that silent place, and spoke to Vidar, the silent god. "O Vidar," he said, "strangest of all my sons, God who will live when all of us have passed away, God who will bring the memory of the dwellers of Asgard into a world that will know not their power. O Vidar, well do I know why there grazes near by thee the horse ever ready for the speedy journey. It is that thou mayst spring upon it and ride unchecked, a son speeding to avenge his father. To you only, O Vidar the Silent One, will I speak of the secrets of my doings. Who but you can know why I, Odin, the eldest of the gods, hung on the tree Yggdrasil 9 days and 9 nights, mine own spear transfixing me? I hung upon that windy tree that I might learn the wisdom that would give me power in the 9 worlds. On the 9th night the runes of wisdom appeared before mine eyes, and slipping down from the tree I took them to myself. And I shall tell why my ravens fly to thee, carrying in their beaks scraps of leather. It is that thou mayest make for thyself a sandal. With that sandal on thou mayest put thy foot on the lower jaw of a mighty wolf and rend him. All the shoemakers of the earth throw on the ground scraps of the leather they use, so that thou mayst be able to make the sandal for thy wolf-rending foot. And I have counselled the dwellers on earth to cut off the fingernails and the toenails of their dead, lest from those fingernails and toenails the giants make for themselves the ship Nagfar, in which they will sail from the north on the day of Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. More, Vidar, I will tell to thee. I, living amongst men, have wed the daughter of a hero. My son shall live as a mortal amongst mortals. Siggi his name shall be. From him shall spring heroes who will fill Valhalla, my own hall in Asgard, with heroes against the day of our strife with the giants, with Surtur of the flaming sword. For long Odin stayed in that silent place, communing with his silent son, with Vidar, who with his brother would live beyond the dwellers of Asgard, and who would bring into another day and another world the memory of the Aesir and the Vanir. For long Odin spoke with him, and then he went across the wilderness where the grass and the bushes grew, and where that horse grazed in readiness for the sudden journey. He went toward the seashore, where the Aesir and the Vanir were now gathered for the feast that old Eiger, the giant king of the sea, had offered them. End of Section 10. Of Odin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. The Children of Odin, the Book of Northern Myths, by Padraic Colum. Part 2. Chapter 5. Thor and Loki in the Giants' City. All but a few of the dwellers of Asgard had come to the feast offered by Eiger the Old, the giant king of the sea. Frigga, the queenly wife of Odin, was there, and Frey and Freya, Iduna, who guarded the apples of youth, and Bragi, her husband, Tyr, the great swordsman, and Njord, the god of the sea, Skadi, who wedded Njord, and whose hatred for Loki was fierce, and Sif, whose golden hair was once shorn off by Loki the mischievous. Thor and Loki were there. The dwellers of Asgard, gathered together in the hall of Eiger, waited for Odin. Before Odin came, Loki made company merry by the tales that he told in mockery of Thor. Loki long since had his lips unloosed from the thong that the dwarf Brock had sewn them with, and Thor had forgotten the wrong that he had done to Sif. Loki had been with Thor in his wanderings through Jotunheim, and about these wanderings he now told mocking tales. He told how he had seen Thor in his chariot of brass drawn by 2 goats go across Bifrost, the rainbow bridge. None of the Aesir or the Vanir knew on what adventure Thor was bent, but Loki followed him, and Thor kept him in his company. As they travelled on in the brass chariot drawn by the 2 goats, Thor told Loki of the adventure on which he was bent. He would go into Jotunheim, even into Utgard, the giant city, and he would try his strength against the giants. He was not afraid of aught that might happen, for he carried Mjolnir, his hammer, with him. Their way was through Midgard, the world of men. Once, as they were travelling on, night came upon them as they were hungry and in need of shelter. They saw a peasant's hut, and they drove the chariot toward it. Unyoking the goats and leaving them standing in a hollow beside the chariot, the 2, looking not like dwellers in Asgard, but like men travelling through the country, knocked at the door of the hut and asked for food and shelter. They could have shelter, the peasant and his wife told them, but they could not have food. There was little in that place, and what little there had been they had eaten for supper. The peasant showed them the inside of the hut. It was poor and bare, and there was nothing there to give any one. In the morning, the peasant said, he would go down to the river and catch some fish for a meal. "We can't wait until morning, we must eat now," said Thor, "and I think I can provide a good meal for us all." He went over to where his goats stood in the hollow beside the chariot of brass, and striking them with his hammer, he left them lifeless on the ground. He skinned the goats then, and taking up the bones very carefully, he left them down on the skins. Skins and bones he lifted up, and bringing them into the house, he left them in a hole above the peasant's fireplace. "No one," he said in a commanding voice, "must touch the bones that I leave here." Then he brought the meat into the house. Soon it was cooked and laid smoking on the table. The peasant and his wife and son sat round the board with Thor and Loki. They had not eaten plentifully for many days, and now the man and the woman fed themselves well. Thjalfi was the name of the peasant's son. He was a growing lad, and had an appetite that had not been satisfied for long. While the meat was on the table, his father and mother had kept him going here and there, carrying water, putting faggots on the fire, and holding a blazing stick so that those at the table might see to eat. There was not much left for him when he was able to sit down, for Thor and Loki had great appetites, and the lad's father and mother had eaten to make up for days of want, so Thjalfi got little out of that plentiful feast. When the meal was finished, they lay down on the benches. Thor, because he had made a long journey that day, slept very soundly. Thjalfi lay down on a bench too, but his thoughts were still upon the food. When all were asleep, he thought, he would take one of the bones that were in the skins above him, and break and gnaw it. So in the dead of the night the lad stood up on the bench and took down the goat-skins that Thor had left so carefully there. He took out a bone, broke it, and gnawed it for the marrow. Loki was awake and saw him do this, but he, relishing mischief as much as ever, did nothing to stay the lad. He put the bone he had broken back in the skins, and he left the skins back in the hole above the fireplace. Then he went to sleep on the bench. In the morning, as soon as they were up, the first thing Thor did was to take the skins out of the hole. He carried them carefully out to the hollow where he had left the goats standing. He put each goat-skin down with the bones in it. He struck each with his hammer, and the goats sprang up alive, horns and hoofs and all. But one was not as he had been before. He limped badly. Thor examined the leg and found out that one bone was broken. In terrible anger he turned on the peasant, his wife, and his son. "A bone of this goat has been broken under your roof," he shouted. "For that I shall destroy your house and leave you all dead under it." Thjalfi wept. Then he came forward and touched the knees of Thor. "I did not know what harm I did," he said. "I broke the bone." Thor had his hammer lifted up to crush him into the earth, but he could not bring it down on the weeping boy. He let his hammer rest on the ground again. "You will have to do much service for me for having lamed my goat," he said. "Come with me." And so the lad Thjalfi went off with Thor and Loki. Thor took in his powerful hands the shafts of the chariot of brass, and he dragged it into a lonely mountain hollow where neither men nor giants came. And they left the goats in a great empty forest to stay resting there until Thor called to them again. Thor and Loki and the lad Thjalfi went across from Midgard into Jotunheim. Because of Mjolnir, the great hammer that he carried, Thor felt safe in the realm of the giants. And Loki, who trusted in his own cunning, felt safe too. The lad Thjalfi trusted in Thor so much that he had no fear. They were long in making the journey, and while they were traveling, Thor and Loki trained Thjalfi to be a quick and a strong lad. One day they came out on a moor. All day they crossed it, and at night it still stretched far before them. A great wind was blowing, night was falling, and they saw no shelter near. In the dusk they saw a shape that looked to be a mountain, and they went toward it, hoping to find some shelter in a cave. Then Loki saw a lower shape that looked as if it might be a shelter. They walked around it, Loki and Thor and the lad Thjalfi. It was a house, but a house most oddly shaped. The entrance was a long, wide hall that had no doorway. When they entered this hall they found 5 long and narrow chambers running off it. "It is an odd place, but it is the best shelter we can get," Loki said. "You and I, Thor, will take the 2 longest rooms, and the lad Thjalfi can take one of the little rooms." They entered their chambers and they lay down to sleep. But from the mountain outside there came a noise that was like moaning forests and falling cataracts. The chamber where each one slept was shaken by the noise. Neither Thor nor Loki nor the lad Thjalfi slept that night. In the morning they left the 5-chambered house and turned their faces toward the mountain. It was not a mountain at all, but a giant. He was lying on the ground when they saw him, but just then he rolled over and sat up. "Little men, little men," he shouted to them, "have you passed by a glove of mine on your way?" He stood up and looked all round him. "Oh, I see my glove now," he said. Thor and Loki and the lad Thialfi stood still as the giant came toward them. He leaned over and picked up the 5-roomed shelter they had slept in. He put it on his hand. It was really his glove. Thor gripped his hammer, and Loki and the lad Thialfi stood behind him. But the giant seemed good-humored enough. "Where might ye be bound for, little men?" said he. "To Utgard in Jotunheim," Thor replied boldly. "Oh, to that place," said the giant. "Come, then, I shall be with ye so far. You can call me Skirmir." "Can you give us breakfast?" said Thor. He spoke crossly, for he did not want it to appear that there was any reason to be afraid of the giant. "I can give you breakfast," said Skirmir, "but I don't want to stop to eat now. We'll sit down as soon as I have an appetite. Come along now. Here is my wallet to carry. It has my provisions in it." He gave Thor his wallet. Thor put it on his back and put Thialfi sitting upon it. On and on the giant strode, and Thor and Loki were barely able to keep up with him. It was midday before he showed any signs of halting to take breakfast. They came to an enormous tree. Under it Skirmir sat down. "I'll sleep before I eat," he said, "but you can open my wallet, little men, and make your meal out of it." Saying this, he stretched himself out, and in a few minutes Thor and Loki and the lad Thialfi heard the same sounds as kept them awake the night before, sounds that were like forests moaning and cataracts falling. It was Skirmir's snoring. Thor and Loki and the lad Thialfi were too hungry now to be disturbed by these tremendous noises. Thor tried to open the wallet, but he found it was not easy to undo the knots. Then Loki tried to open it. In spite of all Loki's cunning, he could not undo the knots. Then Thor took the wallet from him and tried to break the knots by main strength. Not even Thor's strength could break them. He threw the wallet down in his rage. The snoring of Skirmir became louder and louder. Thor stood up in his rage. He grasped Mjolnir and flung it at the head of the sleeping giant. The hammer struck him on the head, but Skirmir only stirred in his sleep. "Did a leaf fall on my head?" he said. He turned round on the other side and went to sleep again. The hammer came back to Thor's hand. As soon as Skirmir snored, he flung it again, aiming at the giant's forehead. It struck there. The giant opened his eyes. "Has an acorn fallen on my head?" he said. Again he went to sleep. But now Thor, terribly roused, stood over his head with the hammer held in his hands. He struck him on the forehead. It was the greatest blow that Thor had ever dealt. "A bird is pecking at my forehead. There's no chance to sleep here," said Skirmir, sitting up. "And you, little men, did you have breakfast yet? Toss over my wallet to me, and I shall give you some provision." The lad Thialfi brought him the wallet. Skirmir opened it, took out his provisions, and gave a share to Thor and Loki and the lad Thialfi. Thor would not take provision from him, but Loki and the lad Thialfi took it and ate. When the meal was finished, Skirmir rose up and said, "Time for us to be going toward Utgard." As they went on their way, Skirmir talked to Loki. "I always feel very small when I go into Utgard," he said. "You see, I'm such a small and a weak fellow, and the folk who live there are so big and powerful. But you and your friends will be welcomed in Utgard. They will be sure to make little pets of you." And then he left them, and they went into Utgard, the city of the giants. Giants were going up and down in the streets. They were not so huge as Skirmir would have them believe, Loki noticed. Utgard was the Asgard of the giants, but in its buildings there was not a line of the beauty that there was in the palaces of the gods, Gladsheim and Breidablik or Fensalir. Huge but shapeless the buildings arose, like mountains or icebergs. O beautiful Asgard, with the dome above it of the deepest blue! Asgard with the clouds around it heaped up like mountains of diamonds! Asgard with its rainbow bridge and its glittering gates! O beautiful Asgard! Could it be indeed that these giants would one day overthrow you? Thor and Loki with the lad Thialfi went to the palace of the king. The hammer that Thor gripped would, they knew, make them safe even there. They passed between rows of giant guards and came to the king's seat. "We know you, Thor and Loki," said the giant king. "And we know that Thor has come to Utgard to try his strength against the giants. We shall have a contest tomorrow. Today there are sports for our boys. If your young servant should like to try his swiftness against our youths, let him enter the race today." Now Thjalfi was the best runner in Midgard, and all the time he had been with them Loki and Thor had trained him in quickness, and so Thjalfi was not fearful of racing against the giants' youths. The king called on one named Hugi and placed him against Thjalfi. The pair started together. Thjalfi sped off. Loki and Thor watched the race anxiously, for they thought it would be well for them if they had a triumph over the dwellers in Utgard in the first contest. But they saw Hugi leave Thjalfi behind. They saw the giant youth reach the winning post, circle round it, and come back to the starting place before Thjalfi had reached the end of the course. Thjalfi, who did not know how it was that he had been beaten, asked that he be let run the race with Hugi again. The pair started off once more, and this time it did not seem to Thor and Loki that Hugi had left the starting place at all. He was back there almost as soon as the race had started. They came back from the racing ground to the palace. The giant king and his friends with Thor and Loki sat down to the supper table. "Tomorrow," said the king, "we shall have our great contest when Asa Thor will show us his power. Have you of Asgard ever heard of one who would enter a contest in eating? We might have a contest in eating at this supper board if we could get one who would match himself with Loki here. He can eat more than anyone in Jotunheim." "And I," said Loki, "can eat more than any two in Jotunheim. I will match myself against your Logi." "Good," said the giant king. And all the giants present said, "Good, this will be a sight worth seeing." Then they put scores of plates along one side of the table, each plate filled with meat. Loki began at one end, and Logi began at the other. They started to eat, moving toward each other as each cleared a plate. Plate after plate was emptied, and Thor, standing by with the giants, was amazed to see how much Loki ate. But Logi on the other side was leaving plate after plate emptied. At last the two stood together with scores of plates on each side of them. "He has not defeated me," cried Loki. "I have cleared as many plates as your champion, O king of the giants." "But you have not cleared them so well," said the king. "Loki has eaten all the meat that was upon them," said Thor. "But Logi has eaten the bones with the meat," said the giant king. "Look and see if it be not so." Thor went to the plates. Where Loki had eaten, the bones were left on the plates. Where Logi had eaten, nothing was left. Bones as well as meat were consumed, and all the plates were left bare. "We are beaten," said Thor to Loki. "Tomorrow, Thor," said Loki, "you must show all your strength, or the giants will cease to dread the might of the dwellers in Asgard." "Be not afraid," said Thor. "No one in Jotunheim will triumph over me." The next day Thor and Loki came into the great hall of Utgard. The giant king was there with a throng of his friends. Thor marched into the hall with Mjolnir, his great hammer, in his hands. "Our young men have been drinking out of this horn," said the king, "and they want to know if you, Asa Thor, would drink out of it a morning draught. But I must tell you they think that no one of the Aesir could empty the horn at one draught." "Give it to me," said Thor. "There is no horn you can hand me that I cannot empty at a draught." A great horn, brimmed and flowing, was brought over to him. Handing Mjolnir to Loki and bidding him stand so that he might keep the hammer in sight, Thor raised the horn to his mouth. He drank and drank. He felt sure there was not a drop left in the horn as he laid it on the ground. "There," he gasped, "your giant horn is drained." The giants looked within the horn and laughed. "Drained, Asa Thor?" said the giant king. "Look into the horn again. You have hardly drunk below the brim." And Thor looked into it and saw that the horn was not half emptied. In a mighty rage he lifted it to his lips again. He drank and drank and drank. Then, satisfied that he had emptied it to the bottom, he left the horn on the ground and walked over to the other side of the hall. "Thor thinks he has drained the horn," said one of the giants, lifting it up. "But see, friends, what remains in it." Thor strode back and looked again into the horn. It was still half filled. He turned round to see that all the giants were laughing at him. "Asa Thor, Asa Thor," said the giant king, "we know not how you are going to deal with us in the next feat, but you certainly are not able to drink against the giants." Said Thor, "I can lift up and set down any being in your hall." As he said this, A great iron-coloured cat bounded into the hall and stood before Thor, her back arched and her fur bristling. "Then lift the cat off the ground," said the giant king. Thor strode to the cat, determined to lift her up and fling her amongst the mocking giants. He put his hands to the cat, but he could not raise her. Up, up went Thor's arms, up, up, as high as they could go. The cat's arched back went up to the roof, but her feet were never taken off the ground. And as he heaved and heaved with all his might, he heard the laughter of the giants all around him. He turned away, his eyes flaming with anger. "I am not wont to try to lift cats," he said. "Bring me one to wrestle with, and I swear you shall see me overthrow him." "Here is one for you to wrestle with, Asa Thor," said the king. Thor looked round and saw an old woman hobbling toward him. She was blear-eyed and toothless. "This is Ellie, my ancient nurse," said the giant king. "She is the one we would have you wrestle with." "Thor does not wrestle with old women. I will lay my hands on your tallest giants instead." "Ellie has come where you are," said the giant king. "Now it is she who will lay hands on you." The old woman hobbled toward Thor, her eyes gleaming under her falling fringes of grey hair. Thor stood, unable to move as the hag came toward him. She laid her hands upon his arms. Her feet began to trip at his. He tried to cast her from him. Then he found that her feet and her hands were as strong against his as bands and stakes of iron. Then began a wrestling match in earnest between Thor and the ancient crone Ellie. Round and round the hall they wrestled, and Thor was not able to bend the old woman backward nor sideways. Instead, he became less and less able under her terrible grasp. She forced him down, down, and at last he could only save himself from being left prone on the ground by throwing himself down on one knee and holding the hag by the shoulders. She tried to force him down on the ground, but she could not do that. Then she broke from him, hobbled to the door, and went out of the hall. Thor rose up and took the hammer from Loki's hands. Without a word he went out of the hall and along the ways and toward the gate of the giants' city. He spoke no word to Loki, nor to the lad Thialfi, who went with him for the 7 weeks that they journeyed through Jotunheim. End of section 11. The Children of Odin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. The Children of Odin, the Book of Northern Myths, by Padraic Colum. Part 2. Chapter 6. How Thor and Loki befooled Thrym the giant. Loki told another tale about Thor and Thrym, a stupid giant who had cunning streaks in him. Loki and Thor had been in this giant's house. He had made a feast for them, and Thor had been unwatchful. Then, when they were far from Jotunheim, Thor missed Mjolnir, missed the hammer that was the defense of Asgard and the help of the gods. He could not remember how or where he had mislaid it. Loki's thoughts went toward Thrym, that stupid giant who yet had cunning streaks in him. Thor, who had lost the hammer that he had sworn never to let out of his sight, did not know what to do. But Loki thought it would be worth while to see if Thrym knew anything about it. He first went to Asgard. He hurried across the Rainbow Bridge, and passed Heimdall without speaking to him. To none of the dwellers in Asgard whom he met did he dare relate the tidings of Thor's loss. He spoke to none until he came to Frigga's palace. To Frigga he said, "You must lend me your falcon dress until I fly to Thrym's dwelling and find out if he knows where Mjolnir is." "If every feather was silver, I would give it to you to go on such an errand," Frigga said. So Loki put on the falcon dress and flew to Jotunheim and came near Thrym's dwelling. He found the giant upon a hillside, putting golden and silver collars upon the necks of his hounds. Loki, in the plumage of a falcon, perched on the rock above him, watching the giant with falcon eyes. And while he was there, he heard the giant speak boastful words. "I put collars of silver and gold on you now, my hounds," said he, "but soon we giants will have the gold of Asgard to deck our hounds and our steeds, yea, even the necklace of Freya to put upon you, the best of my hounds. For Mjolnir, the defense of Asgard,
is in Thrym's holding." Then Loki spoke to him. "Yea, we know that Mjolnir is in thy possession, O Thrym," he said. "But know thou that the eyes of the watchful gods are upon thee." "Ha, Loki, shape-changer," said Thrym. "You are there, but all your watching will not help you to find Mjolnir. I have buried Thor's hammer 8 miles deep in the earth. Find it if you can. It is below the caves of the dwarfs." "It is useless for us to search for Thor's hammer," said Loki. "Eh, Thrym?" "It is useless for you to search for it," said the giant sulkily. "But what a recompense you would gain if you restored Thor's hammer to the dwellers in Asgard," Loki said. "No, cunning Loki, I will never restore it, not for any recompense," said Thrym. "Yet bethink thee, Thrym," said Loki. "Is there naught in Asgard you would like to own? No treasure, no possession? Odin's ring or Frey's ship Skidbladnir?" "No, no," said Thrym. "Only one thing could the dwellers in Asgard offer me that I would take in exchange for Mjolnir, Thor's hammer." "And what would that be, Thrym?" said Loki, flying toward him. "She whom many giants have striven to gain, Freya, for my wife," said Thrym. Loki watched Thrym for long with his falcon eyes. He saw that the giant would not alter his demand. "I will tell the dwellers in Asgard of your demand," he said at last, and he flew away. Loki knew that the dwellers in Asgard would never let Freya be taken from them to become the wife of Thrym, the stupidest of the giants. He flew back. By this time all the dwellers in Asgard had heard of the loss of Mjolnir, the help of the gods. Heimdall shouted to him as he crossed the rainbow bridge to ask what tidings he brought back. But Loki did not stop to speak to the warden of the bridge, but went straight to the hall where the gods sat in council. To the Aesir and the Vanir he told Thrym's demand. None would agree to let the beautiful Freya go to live in Jotunheim as a wife to the stupidest of the giants. All in the council were cast down. The gods would never again be able to help mortal men, for now that Mjolnir was in the giants' hands, all their strength would have to be used in the defense of Asgard. So they sat in the council with looks downcast. But cunning Loki said, "I have thought of a trick that may win back the hammer from stupid Thrym. Let us pretend to send Freya to Jotunheim as a bride for him, but let one of the gods go in Freya's veil and dress." "Which of the gods would bring himself to do so shameful a thing?" said those in the council. "Oh, he who lost the hammer, Thor, should be prepared to do as much to win it back," said Loki. "Thor, Thor! Let Thor win back the hammer from Thrym by Loki's trick," said the Aesir and the Vanir. They left it to Loki to arrange how Thor should go to Jotunheim as a bride for Thrym. Loki left the council of the gods and came to where he had left Thor. "There is but one way to win the hammer back, Thor," he said, "and the gods in council have decreed that you shall take it." "What is the way?" said Thor. "But no matter what it is, tell me of it, and I shall do as thou dost say." "Then," said laughing Loki, "I am to take you to Jotunheim as a bride for Thrym. Thou art to go in bridal dress and veil, in Freya's veil and bridal dress." "What? I dress in woman's garb?" shouted Thor. "Yea, Thor, and wear a veil over your head and a garland of flowers upon it." "I? I wear a garland of flowers?" "And rings upon thy fingers, and a bunch of housekeeper's keys in thy girdle." "Cease thy mockery, Loki," said Thor roughly, "or I shall shake thee." "It is no mockery. Thou wilt have to do this to win Mjolnir back for the defense of Asgard. Thrym will take no other recompense than Freya. I would mock him by bringing thee to him in Freya's veil and dress. When thou art in his hall and he asks thee to join hands with him, say thou wilt not until he puts Mjolnir into thy hands. Then, when thy mighty hammer is in thy holding, thou canst deal with him and with all in his hall. And I shall be with thee as thy bridesmaid, O sweet, sweet maiden Thor." "Loki," said Thor, "thou didst devise all this to mock me. I in a bridal dress! I with a bride's veil upon me! The dwellers in Asgard will never cease to laugh at me." "Yea," said Loki, "but there will never be laughter again in Asgard unless thou art able to bring back the hammer that thine unwatchfulness lost." "True," said Thor unhappily. "And is this, thinkst thou, Loki, the only way to win back Mjolnir from Thrym?" "It is the only way, O Thor," said the cunning Loki. So Thor and Loki set out for Jotunheim and the dwelling of Thrym. A messenger had gone before them to tell Thrym that Freya was coming with her bridesmaid, that the wedding feast was to be prepared and the guests gathered, and that Mjolnir was to be at hand so that it might be given over to the dwellers in Asgard. Thrym and his giant mother hastened to have everything in readiness. Thor and Loki came to the giant's house in the dress of a bride and a bridesmaid. A veil was over Thor's head, hiding his beard and his fierce eyes. A red embroidered robe he wore, and at his side hung a girdle of housekeeper's keys. Loki was veiled too. The hall of Thrym's great house was swept and garnished, and great tables were laid for the feast. And Thrym's mother was going from one guest to another, vaunting that her son was getting one of the beauteous dwellers in Asgard for his bride, Freya, whom so many of the giants had tried to win. When Thor and Loki stepped across the threshold, Thrym went to welcome them. He wanted to raise the veil of his bride and give her a kiss. Loki quickly laid his hand on the giant's shoulder. "Forbear," he whispered. "Do not raise her veil. We dwellers in Asgard are reserved and bashful. Freya would be much offended to be kissed before this company." "Aye, aye," said Thrym's old mother. "Do not raise thy bride's veil, son. These dwellers in Asgard are more refined in their ways than we, the giants." Then the old woman took Thor by the hand and led him to the table. The size and the girth of the bride did not surprise the huge giants who were in the wedding company. They stared at Thor and Loki, but they could see nothing of their faces, and little of their forms because of their veils. Thor sat at the table with Thrym on one side of him and Loki on the other. Then the feast began. Thor, not noticing that what he did was unbecoming to a refined maiden, ate 8 salmon right away. Loki nudged him and pressed his foot, but he did not heed Loki. After the salmon he ate a whole ox. "These maids of Asgard," said the giants to each other, "they may be refined, as Thrym's mother says, but their appetites are lusty enough." "No wonder she eats, poor thing," said Loki to Thrym. "It is 8 days since we left Asgard, and Freya never ate upon the way, so anxious was she to see Thrym and come to his house." Poor darling," said the giant. "What she has eaten is little after all." Thor nodded his head toward the mead vat. Thrym ordered his servants to bring a measure to his bride. The servants were kept coming with measures to Thor. While the giants watched, and while Loki nudged and nodded, he drank 3 barrels of mead. "Oh," said the giants to Thrym's mother, "we are not so sorry that we failed to win a bride from Asgard." And now a piece of the veil slipped aside, and Thor's eyes were seen for an instant. "Oh, how does it come that Freya has such glaring eyes?" said Thrym. Poor thing," said Loki. "No wonder her eyes are glaring and staring. She has not slept for 8 nights, so anxious was she to come to you and to your house, Thrym. But now the time has come for you to join hands with your bride. First put into her hands the hammer Mjolnir, that she may know the great recompense that the giants have given for her coming." Then Thrym, the stupidest of the giants, rose up and brought Mjolnir, the defense of Asgard, into the feasting hall. Thor could hardly restrain himself from springing up and seizing it from the giant, but Loki was able to keep him still. Thrym brought over the hammer and put the handle into the hands of her whom he thought was his bride. Thor's hands closed on his hammer. Instantly he stood up. The veil fell off him. His countenance and his blazing eyes were seen by all. He struck one blow on the wall of the house. Down it crashed. Then Thor went striding out of the ruin with Loki beside him, while within the giants bellowed as the roof and walls fell down on them. And so was Mjolnir, the defense of Asgard, lost and won back. End of section 12. of the Children of Odin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. The Children of Odin, the Book of Northern Myths, by Padraic Colum. Part 2, Chapter 7. Eiger's Feast, How Thor Triumphed. The time between midday and evening wore on while the Aesir and the Vanir gathered for the feast in old Eiger's hall, listened to the stories that Loki told in mockery of Thor. The night came, but no banquet was made ready for the dwellers in Asgard. They called to Eiger's 2 underservants, Fimafengir and Elder, and they bade them bring them a supper. Slight was what they got, but they went to bed, saying, "Great must be the preparations that old Eiger is making to feast us tomorrow." The morrow came, and the midday of the morrow, and still the dwellers in Asgard saw no preparations being made for the banquet. Then Frey rose up and went to seek old Eiger, the giant king of the sea. He found him sitting with bowed head in his inner hall. "Ho, Eiger," he said, "what of the banquet that you have offered to the dwellers in Asgard?" Old Eiger mumbled and pulled at his beard. At last he looked his guest in the face and told why the banquet was not being made ready. The mead for the feast was not yet brewed, and there was little chance of being able to brew mead that would do for all, for Eiger's hall was lacking a mead kettle that would contain enough. When the Aesir and the Vanir heard this they were sorely disappointed. Who now, outside of Asgard, would give them a feast? Eiger was the only one of the giants who was friendly to them, and Eiger could not give them full entertainment. Then a giant youth who was there spoke up and said, "My kinsman, the giant Hrymer, has a mead kettle that is a mile wide. If we could bring Hrymer's kettle here, what a feast we might have!" "One of us can go for that kettle," Frey said. "Ah, but Hrymer's dwelling is beyond the deepest forest and behind the highest mountain," the giant youth said, "and Hrymer himself is a rough and a churlish one to call on." "Still one of us should go," Frey said. "I will go to Hrymer's dwelling," said Thor, standing up. "I will go to Hrymer's dwelling and get the mile-wide kettle from him by force or cunning." He had been sitting subdued under the mocking tales that Loki told of him, and he was pleased with this chance to make his prowess plain to the Aesir and the Vanir. He buckled on the belt that doubled his strength. He drew on the iron gloves that enabled him to grasp Mjolnir. He took his hammer in his hands, and he signed to the giant youth to come with him and be his guide. The Aesir and the Vanir applauded Thor as he stepped out of old Eiger's hall, but Loki, mischievous Loki, threw a gibe after him. "Do not let the hammer out of your hands this time, bride of Thrym," he shouted. Thor, with the giant youth to guide him, went through the deepest forest and over the highest mountain. He came at last to the giant's dwelling. On a hillock before Hrymer's house was a dreadful warden. A giant crone she was, with heads a many growing out of her shoulders. She was squatting down on her ankles, and her heads, growing in bunches, were looking in different directions. As Thor and the giant youth came near, screams and yelps came from all her heads. Thor grasped his hammer and would have flung it at her if a giant woman, making a sign of peace, had not come to the door of the dwelling. The youthful giant who was with Thor greeted her as his mother. "Son, come within," said she, "and you may bring your fellow farer with you." The giant crone, she was Hrymer's grandmother, kept up her screaming and yelping, but Thor went past her and into the giant's dwelling. When she saw that it was one of the dwellers in Asgard who had come with her son, the giant woman grew fearful for them both. "Hrymer," she said, "will be in a rage to find one of the Aesir under his roof. He will strive to slay you." "It is not likely he will succeed," Thor said, grasping Mjolnir, the hammer that all the giant race knew of and dreaded. "Hide from him," said the giant woman. "He may injure my son in his rage to find you here." "I am not wont to hide from the giants," Thor said. "Hide only for a little while. Hide until Hrymer has eaten," the giant woman pleaded. "He comes back from the chase in a stormy temper. After he has eaten he is easier to deal with. Hide until he has finished supper." Thor at last agreed to do this. He and the giant youth hid behind a pillar in the hall. They were barely hidden when they heard the clatter of the giant's step as he came through the courtyard. He came to the door. His beard was like a frozen forest around his mouth, and he dragged along with him a wild bull that he had captured in the chase. So proud was he of his capture that he dragged it into the hall. "I have taken alive," he shouted, "the bull with the mightiest head and horns. Heaven-breaking this bull is called. No giant but me could capture it." He tied the bull to the post of the door, and then his eyes went toward the pillar behind which Thor and the giant youth were hiding. The pillar split up its whole length at that look from Hrymer's eyes. He came nearer. The pillar of stone broke across. It fell with the cross-beam it supported, and all the kettles and cauldrons that were hanging on the beam came down with a terrible rattle. Then Thor stepped out and faced the wrathful giant. "It is I who am here, friend Hrymer," he said, his hands resting on his hammer. Then Hrymer, who knew Thor and knew the force of Thor's hammer, drew back. "Now that you are in my house, Asa Thor," he said, "I will not quarrel with you. Make supper ready for Asa Thor and your son and myself," said he to the giant woman. A plentiful supper was spread, and Hrymer and Thor and the giant youth sat down to 3 whole roast oxen. Thor ate the whole of 1 ox. Hrymer, who had eaten nearly 2 himself, leaving only small cuts for his wife and his youthful kinsman, grumbled at Thor's appetite. "You'll clear my fields, Asa Thor," he said, "if you stay long with me." "Do not grumble, Hrymer," Thor said. "Tomorrow I'll go fishing, and I'll bring you back the weight of what I ate." "Then instead of hunting I'll go fishing with you tomorrow, Asa Thor," said Hrymer, "and don't be frightened if I take you out on a rough sea." Hrymer was first out of bed the next morning. He came with the pole and the ropes in his hand to where Thor was sleeping. "Time to start earning your meal, Asa Thor," said he. Thor got out of bed, and when they were both in the courtyard the giant said, "You'll have to provide a bait for yourself. Mind that you take a bait large enough. It is not where the little fishes are, the place where I'm going to take you. If you never saw monsters before, you'll see them now. I'm glad, Asa Thor, that you spoke of going fishing." "Will this bait be big enough?" said Thor, laying his hands on the horns of the bull that Hrymer had captured and brought home, the bull with the mighty head of horns that was called Heaven-breaking. "Will this bait be big enough, do you think?" "Yes, if you are big enough to handle it," said the giant. Thor said nothing, but he struck the bull full in the middle of the forehead with his fist. The great creature fell down dead. Thor then twisted the bull's head off. "I have my bait, and I'm ready to go with you, Hrymer," he said. Hrymer had turned away to hide the rage he was in at seeing Thor do such a feat. He walked down to the boat without speaking. "You may row for the first few strokes," said Hrymer when they were in the boat, "but when we come to where the ocean is rough, why, I'll take the oars from you." Without saying a word Thor made a few strokes that took the boat out into the middle of the ocean. Hrymer was in a rage to think that he could not show himself greater than Thor. He let out his line and began to fish. Soon he felt something huge on his hook. The boat rocked and rocked till Thor steadied it. Then Hrymer drew into the boat the largest whale that was in these seas. "Good fishing," said Thor, as he put his own bait on the line. "It's something for you to tell the Aesir," said Hrymer. "I thought as you were here I'd show you something bigger than salmon fishing." "I'll try my luck now," said Thor. He threw out a line that had at the end of it the mighty horned head of the great bull. Down, down the head went. It passed where the whales swim, and the whales were afraid to gulp at the mighty horns. Down, down it went, till it came near where the monster serpent that coils itself round the world abides. It reared its head up from its serpent coils as Thor's bait came down through the depths of the ocean. It gulped at the head and drew it into its gullet. There the great hook stuck. Terribly surprised was the serpent monster. It lashed the ocean into a fury. But still the hook stayed. Then it strove to draw down to the depths of the ocean the boat of those who had hooked it. Thor put his legs across the boat and stretched them till they touched the bottom bed of the ocean. On the bottom bed of the ocean Thor stood and he pulled on his line. The serpent monster lashed the ocean into fiercer and fiercer storms, and all the world's ships were hurled against each other and wrecked and tossed. but it had to loosen coil after coil of the coils it makes around the world. Thor pulled and pulled. Then the terrible head of the serpent monster appeared above the waters. It reared over the boat that Hrymer sat in and that Thor straddled across. Thor dropped the line and took up Mjolnir, his mighty hammer. He raised it to strike the head of the serpent monster, whose coils go round the world. But Hrymer would not have that happen. Rather than have Thor pass him by such a feat, he cut the line, and the head of the serpent monster sank back into the sea. Thor's hammer was raised. He hurled that hammer that always came back to his hand. It followed the sinking head through fathom after fathom of the ocean deep. It struck the serpent monster a blow, but not such a deadly blow as would have been struck if the water had not come between. A bellow of pain came up from the depths of the ocean, such a bellow of pain that all in Jotunheim were affrighted. "This surely is something to tell the Aesir of," said Thor. "Something to make them forget Loki's mockeries." Without speaking, Hrymer turned the boat and rowed toward the shore, dragging the whale in the wake. He was in such a rage to think that one of the Aesir had done a feat surpassing his that he would not speak. At supper, too, he remained silent, but Thor talked for two, boasting loudly of his triumph over the monster serpent. "No doubt you think yourself very powerful, Asa Thor," Hrymer said at last. "Well, do you think you are powerful enough to break the cup that is before you?" Thor took up the cup, and with a laugh he hurled it against the stone pillar of the house. The cup fell down on the floor without a crack or a dint in it, but the pillar was shattered with the blow. The giant laughed. "So feeble are the folk of Asgard," he said. Thor took up the cup again and flung it with greater force against the stone pillar. And again the cup fell to the ground without a crack or a dint. Then he heard the woman who was the mother of the giant youth sing softly as she plied her wheel behind him. "Not at the pillar of the stead, but at Hrymer's massy head, when you next the goblet throw, let his head receive the blow." Thor took up the cup again. He flung it not at the pillar this time, but at Hrymer's head. It struck the giant full on the forehead and fell down on the floor in pieces, and Hrymer's head was left without a dint or a crack. "Ha! So you can break a cup, but can you lift up my mile-wide kettle?" cried the giant. "Show me where your mile-wide kettle is, and I shall try to lift it," cried Thor. The giant took up the flooring and showed him the mile-wide kettle down in the cellar. Thor stooped up and took the kettle by the brim. He lifted it slowly, as if with a mighty effort. "You can lift, but can you carry it?" said the giant. "I will try to do that," said Thor. He lifted the kettle up and placed it on his head. He strode to the door and out of the house before the giant could lay hands on him. Then, when he was outside, he started to run. He was across the mountain before he looked behind him. He heard a yelping and a screaming, and he saw the giant crone with the bunch of heads running after him. Up hill and down dale Thor raced, the mile-wide kettle on his head, and the giant crone in chase of him. Through the deep forest he ran, and over the high mountain, but still Bunch of Heads kept him in chase. But at last, jumping over a lake, she fell in, and Thor was free of his pursuer. And so back to the Aesir and the Vanir Thor came in triumph, carrying on his head the mile-wide kettle. And those of the Aesir and the Vanir who had laughed most at Loki's mockeries rose up and cheered for him as he came in. The mead was brewed, the feast was spread, and the greatest banquet that ever the kings of the giants gave to the dwellers in Asgard was eaten in gladness. A strange and silent figure sat at the banquet. It was the figure of a giant, and no one knew who he was nor where he had come from. But when the banquet was ended, Odin, the eldest of the gods, turned toward this figure and said, "O Skirmir, giant king of Utgard, rise up now and tell Thor of all you practiced upon him when he and Loki came to your city." Then the stranger at the banquet stood up, and Thor and Loki saw he was the giant king in whose halls they had had the contests. Skirmir turned toward them and said, "O Thor, and O Loki, I will reveal to you now the deceits I practiced on you both. It was I whom ye met on the moorland on the day before ye came into Utgard. I gave you my name as Skirmir, and I did all I might do to prevent your entering our city, for the giants dreaded a contest of strength with Asa Thor. Now hear me, O Thor. The wallet I gave for you to take provisions out of was tied with magic knots. No one could undo them by strength or cleverness, and while you were striving to undo them, I placed a mountain of rock between myself and you. The hammer blows which, as you thought, struck me, struck the mountain and made great clefts and gaps in it. When I knew the strength of your tremendous blows I was more and more in dread of your coming into our city. I saw you would have to be deceived by magic. Your lad Thialfi was the one whom I first deceived. For it was not a giant youth who raced against him, but thought itself. And even you, O Loki, I deceived, for when you tried to make yourself out the greatest of eaters, I pitted against you, not a giant, but fire that devours everything. You, Thor, were deceived in all the contests. After you had taken the drinking horn in your hands we were all affrighted to see how much you were able to gulp down. For the end of that horn was in the sea, and Eiger, who is here, can tell you that after you had drunk from it, the level of the sea went down. The cat whom you strove to lift was Nidhogg, the dragon that gnaws at the roots of Yggdrasil, the tree of trees. Truly we were terrified when we saw that you made Nidhogg budge. When you made the back of the cat reach the roof of our palace we said to ourselves, Thor is the mightiest of all the beings we have known. Lastly, you strove with the hag Ellie. Her strength seemed marvelous to you, and you thought yourself disgraced because you could not throw her. But know, Thor, that Ellie whom you wrestled with was old age herself. We were terrified again to see that she who can overthrow all was not able to force you prone upon the ground. So Skimir spoke, and then left the hall. And once more the Aesir and the Vanir stood up and cheered for Thor, the strongest of all who guarded Asgard. End of Section 13. Of the Children of Odin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. The Children of Odin, the Book of Northern Myths, by Padraic Colum. Part 2, Chapter 8. The Dwarf's Hoard, and the Curse that it brought. Now old Aegir's feast was over, and all the Aesir and the Vanir made ready for their return to Asgard. 2 only went on another way, Odin, the eldest of the gods, and Loki, the mischievous. Loki and Odin laid aside all that they had kept of the divine power and the divine strength. They were going into the world of men, and they would be as men merely. Together they went through Midgard, mingling with men of all sorts, kings and farmers, outlaws and true men, warriors and householders, thralls and counselors, courteous men, and men who were ill-mannered. One day they came to the bank of a mighty river, and there they rested, listening to the beat of iron upon iron in a place near by. Presently on a rock in the middle of the river they saw an otter come. The otter went into the water and came back to the rock with a catch of salmon. He devoured it there. Then Odin saw Loki do a senseless and an evil thing. Taking up a great stone, he flung it at the otter. The stone struck the beast on the skull and knocked him over dead. "Loki, Loki, why hast thou done a thing so senseless and so evil?" Odin said. Loki only laughed. He swam across the water and came back with the creature of the river. "Why didst thou take the life of the beast?" Odin said. "The mischief in me made me do it," said Loki. He drew out his knife, and ripping the otter up he began to flay him. When the skin was off the beast he folded it up and stuck it in his belt. Then Odin and he left that place by the river. They came to a house with 2 smithies beside it, and from the smithies came the sound of iron beating upon iron. They went within the house, and they asked that they might eat there and rest themselves. An old man who was cooking fish over a fire pointed out a bench to them. "Rest there," said he, "and when the fish is cooked I will give you something good to eat. My son is a fine fisher, and he brings me salmon of the best." Odin and Loki sat on the bench, and the old man went on with his cooking. "My name is Hreidmar," he said, and I have 2 sons who work in the smithies without. I have a 3rd son also. It is he who does the fishing for us. And who may ye be, O wayfaring men?" Loki and Odin gave names to Hreidmar that were not the names by which they were known in Asgard or on Midgard. Hreidmar served fish to them, and they ate. "And what adventures have ye met upon your travels?" Hreidmar asked. "Few folk come this way to tell me of happenings." "I killed an otter with a cast of a stone," Loki said with a laugh. "You killed an otter?" Hreidmar cried. "Where did you kill one?" "Where I killed him is of no import to you, old man," said Loki. "His skin is a good one, however. I have it at my belt." Hreidmar snatched the skin out of Loki's belt. As soon as he held the skin before his eyes, he shrieked out, "Fafnir! Regin! My sons, come here and bring the thralls of your smithies. Come, come, come!" "Why dost thou make such an outcry, old man?" said Odin. "Ye have slain my son Otter!" shrieked the old man. "This in my hands is the skin of my son." As Hreidmar said this, 2 young men bearing the forehammers of the smithies came in, followed by the thralls. "Strike these men dead with your forehammers, O Fafnir, O Regin!" their father cried. "Otter, who used to stay in the river, and whom I changed by enchantment into a river beast that he might fish for me, has been slain by these men." "Peace," said Odin. "We have slain thy son, it would seem, but it was unwittingly that we did the deed. We will give a recompense for the death of thy son." "What recompense will ye give?" said Hreidmar, looking at Odin with eyes that were small and sharp. Then did Odin, the eldest of the gods, say a word that was unworthy of his wisdom and his power. He might have said, "I will bring thee a draught of Mimir's well water as a recompense for thy son's death." But instead of thinking of wisdom, Odin All-Father thought of gold. "Set a price on the life of thy son, and we will pay that price in gold," he said. "Maybe ye are great kings traveling through the world," Hreidmar said. "If ye are, ye will have to find gold that will cover every hair upon the skin of him whom you have killed." Then did Odin, his mind being fixed upon the gold, think upon a certain treasure, a treasure that was guarded by a dwarf. No other treasure in the 9 worlds would be great enough to make the recompense that Hreidmar claimed. He thought upon this treasure, and he thought on how it might be taken, and yet he was ashamed of his thought. "Dost thou, Loki, know of Andvari's hoard?" he said. "I know of it," said Loki sharply, "and I know where it is hidden. Wilt thou, Odin, win leave for me to fetch Andvari's hoard?" Odin spoke to Hreidmar. "I will stay with thee as a hostage," he said, "if thou wilt let this one go to fetch a treasure that will cover the otter's skin hair by hair." "I will let this be done," said old Hreidmar with the sharp and cunning eyes. "Go now," said he to Loki. Then Loki went from the house. Andvari was a dwarf who in the early days had gained for himself the greatest treasure in the 9 worlds. So that he might guard this treasure unceasingly, he changed himself into a fish, into a pike, and he swam in the water before the cave where the hoard was hidden. All in Asgard knew of the dwarf and of the hoard he guarded, and there was a thought amongst all that this hoard was not to be meddled with, and that some evil was joined to it. But now Odin had given the word that it was to be taken from the dwarf. Loki set out for Andvari's cave rejoicingly. He soon came to the pool before the cave, and he watched for a sight of Andvari. Soon he saw the pike swimming cautiously before the cave. He would have to catch the pike and hold him till the treasure was given for ransom. As he watched, the pike became aware of him. Suddenly he flung himself forward in the water and went with speed down the stream. Not with his hands and not with any hook and line could Loki catch that pike. How then could he take him? Only with a net that was woven by magic. Then Loki thought of where he might get such a net. Ran, the wife of old Eiger, the giant king of the sea, had a net that was woven by magic. In it she took all that was wrecked on the sea. Loki thought of Ran's net, and he turned and went back to Aegir's hall to ask for the queen. But Ran was seldom in her husband's dwelling. She was now down by the rocks of the sea. He found Ran, the cold queen, standing in the flow of the sea, drawing out of the depths with the net that she held in her hands every piece of treasure that was washed that way. She had made a heap of the things she had drawn out of the sea, corals and amber, and bits of gold and silver, but still she was plying her net greedily. "Thou knowest me, Aegir's wife," said Loki to her. "I know thee, Loki," said Queen Ran. "Lend me thy net," said Loki. "That I will not do," said Queen Ran. "Lend me thy net that I may catch Andvari the dwarf, who boasts that he has a greater treasure than ever thou wilt take out of the sea," said Loki. The cold Queen of the Sea ceased plying her net. She looked at Loki steadily. Yes, if he were going to catch Andvari she would lend her net to him. She hated all the dwarfs, because this one and that one had told her they had greater treasures than ever she would be mistress of. But especially she hated Andvari, the dwarf who had the greatest treasure in the 9 worlds. "There is nothing more to gather here," she said, "and if thou wilt swear to bring me back my net by tomorrow, I shall lend it to you." "I swear by the sparks of Muspelheim that I will bring thy net back to thee by tomorrow, O Queen of Aegir," Loki cried. Then Ran put into his hands the magic net. Back then he went to where the dwarf, transformed, was guarding his wondrous hoard. Dark was the pool in which Andvari floated as a pike. Dark it was, but to him it was all golden with the light of his wondrous treasure. For the sake of this hoard he had given up his companionship with the dwarfs and his delight in making and shaping the things of their workmanship. For the sake of his hoard he had taken on himself the dumbness and deafness of a fish. Now as he swam about before the cave he was aware again of a shadow above him. He slipped toward the shadow of the bank. Then as he turned round he saw a net sweeping toward him. He sank down in the water, but the magic net had spread out and he sank into its meshes. Suddenly he was out of the water and was left gasping on the bank. He would have died had he not undone his transformation. Soon he appeared as a dwarf. "Andvari, you are caught. It is one of the Aesir who has taken you," he heard his captor say. "Loki," he gasped. "Thou art caught, and thou shalt be held," Loki said to him. "It is the will of the Aesir that thou give up thy hoard to me." "My hoard? My hoard?" the dwarf shouted. "Never will I give up my hoard." "I hold thee till thou givest it to me," said Loki. "Unjust, unjust!" shouted Andvari. "It is only thou, Loki, who art unjust. I will go to the throne of Odin, and I will have Odin punish thee for striving to rob me of my treasure." "Odin has sent me to fetch thy hoard to him," said Loki. "Can it be that all the Aesir are unjust? Ah, yes. In the beginning of things they cheated the giant who built the wall round their city. The Aesir are unjust." Loki had Andvari in his power, and after the dwarf had raged against him and defied him, he tormented him. At last, trembling with rage and with his face covered with tears, Andvari took Loki into his cavern, and turning a rock aside, showed him the mass of gold and gems that was his hoard. At once Loki began to gather into the magic net lumps and ingots and circlets of gold, with gems that were rubies and sapphires and emeralds. He saw Andvari snatch at something on the heap, but he made no sign of marking it. At last all was gathered into the net, and Loki stood there ready to bear the dwarf's hoard away. "There is one more thing to be given," said Loki. "The ring that you, Andvari, snatched from the heap." "I snatched nothing," said the dwarf. But he shook with anger, and his teeth gnashed together, and froth came on his lips. "I snatched nothing from the heap." But Loki pulled up his arm, and there fell to the ground the ring that Andvari had hidden under his armpit. It was the most precious thing in all the hoard. Had it been left with him, Andvari would have thought that he still possessed a treasure, for this ring of itself could make gold. It was made out of gold that was refined of all impurities, and it was engraven with a rune of power. Loki took up this most precious ring and put it on his finger. Then the dwarf screamed at him, turning his thumbs toward him in a curse. "The ring with the rune of power upon it. May it weigh down your fortune and load you with evil. You, Loki, and all who lust to possess the ring I have cherished." As Andvari uttered this curse, Loki saw a figure rise up in the cave and move toward him. As this figure came near he knew who it was: Gulveig, a giant woman who had once been in Asgard. Far back in the early days, when the gods had come to their holy hill, and before Asgard was built, 3 women of the giants had come amongst the Aesir. After the 3 had been with them for a time, the lives of the Aesir changed. Then did they begin to value and to hoard the gold that they had played with. Then did they think of war. Odin hurled his spear amongst the messengers that came from the Vanir, and war came into the world. The 3 were driven out of Asgard. Peace was made with the Vanir. The apples of lasting youth were grown in Asgard. The eagerness for gold was curbed. But never again were the Aesir as happy as they were before the women came to them from the giants. Gulveig was one of the 3 who had blighted the early happiness of the gods. And behold, she was in the cave where Andvari had hoarded his treasure, and with a smile upon her face she was advancing toward Loki. "So, Loki," she said, "thou seest me again, and Odin who sent thee to this cave will see me again. Lo, Loki, I go to Odin to be thy messenger and to tell him that thou comest with Andvari's hoard." And speaking so, and smiling into his face, Gulveig went out of the cave with swift and light steps. Loki drew the ends of the magic net together, and gathering all the treasures in its meshes, he too went out. Odin, the eldest of the gods, stood leaning on his spear and looking at the skin of the otter that was spread out before him. One came into the dwelling swiftly. Odin looked and saw that she who had come in on such swift, glad feet was Gulveig, who once with her 2 companions had troubled the happiness of the gods. Odin raised his spear to cast it at her. "Lay thy spear down, Odin," she said. "I dwelt for long in the dwarf's cave. But thy word unloosed me, and the curse said over Andvari's ring has sent me here. Lay thy spear down and look on me, O eldest of the gods. Thou didst cast me out of Asgard, but thy word has brought me to come back to thee. And if ye too, Odin and Loki, have bought yourselves free with gold and may enter Asgard, surely I, Gulveig, am free to enter Asgard also." Odin lowered his spear, sighing deeply. "Surely it is so, Gulveig," he said. "I may not forbid thee to enter Asgard. Would I had thought of giving the man Kvasir's mead or Mimir's well water rather than this gold as a recompense." As they spoke, Loki came into Hreidmar's dwelling. He laid on the floor the magic net. Old Hreidmar with his sharp eyes, and huge Fafnir, and lean and hungry-looking Regin came in to gaze on the golden gems that shone through the meshes. They began to push each other away from gazing at the gold. Then Hreidmar cried out, "No one may be here but these 2 kings and I, while we measure out the gold and gems, and see whether the recompense be sufficient. Go without, sons of mine." Then Fafnir and Regin were forced to go out of the dwelling. They went out slowly, and Gulveig went with them, whispering to both. With shaking hands old Hreidmar spread out the skin that once covered his son. He drew out the ears and the tail and the paws so that every single hair could be shown. For long he was on his hands and knees, his sharp eyes searching over every line of the skin. And still on his knees he said, "Begin now, O kings, and cover with a gem or a piece of gold every hair on the skin that was my son's." Odin stood leaning on his spear, watching the gold and gems being paid out. Loki took the gold, the ingots and the lumps and the circlets. He took the gems, the rubies and the emeralds and the sapphires, and he began to place them over each hair. Soon the middle of the skin was all covered. Then he put the gems and the gold over the paws and the tail. Soon the otter skin was so glittering that one would think it could light up the world. And still Loki went on finding a place where a gem or a piece of gold might be put. At last he stood up. Every gem and every piece of gold had been taken out of the net, and every hair on the otter's skin had been covered with a gem or a piece of gold. And still old Hreidmar on his hands and knees was peering over the skin, searching for a hair that was not covered. At last he lifted himself up on his knees. His mouth was open, but he was speechless. He touched Odin on the knees, and when Odin bent down he showed him a hair upon the lip that was left uncovered. "What meanest thou?" Loki cried, turning upon the crouching man. "Your ransom is not paid yet. Look, here is still a hair uncovered. You may not go until every hair is covered with gold or a gem." "Peace, old man," said Loki roughly. "All the dwarf's hoard has been given thee." "Ye may not go until every hair has been covered," Hreidmar said again. "There is no more gold or gems," Loki answered. "Then ye may not go," cried Hreidmar, springing up. It was true. Odin and Loki might not leave that dwelling until the recompense they had agreed to was paid in full. Where now would the Aesir go for gold? And then Odin saw the gleam of gold on Loki's finger. It was the ring he had forced from Andvari. "Thy finger ring," said Odin. "Put thy finger ring over the hair on the otter's skin." Loki took off the ring that was engraved with the rune of power, and he put it on the lip hair of the otter's skin. Then Hreidmar clapped his hands and screamed aloud. Huge Fafnir and lean and hungry-looking Regin came within, and Gulveig came behind them. They stood around the skin of the son and the brother that was all glittering with gold and gems. But they looked at each other more than they looked on the glittering mass, and very deadly were the looks that Fafnir and Regin cast upon their father and cast upon each other. Over Bifrost, the rainbow bridge, went all of the Aesir and the Vanir that had been at old Aegir's feast: Frey and Freya, Frigga, Iduna, and Sif, Tyr with his sword, and Thor in his chariot drawn by the goats. Loki came behind them, and behind them all came Odin, the father of the gods. He went slowly with his head bent, for he knew that an unwelcome one was following, Gulveig, who once had been cast out of Asgard, and whose return now the gods might not gainsay. End of Part 2. End of Section 14. Of the Children of Odin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. The Children of Odin, the Book of Northern Myths, by Padraic Colum. Part 3. The Witch's Heart. Chapter 1. Foreboding in Asgard. What happened afterwards is a shame to the gods, and mortals may hardly speak of it. Gulveig the witch came into Asgard, for Heimdall might not forbid her entrance. She came within, and she had her seat amongst the Aesir and the Vanir. She walked through Asgard with a smile upon her face, and where she walked and where she smiled, care and dire foreboding came. Those who felt the care and the foreboding most deeply were Bragi the poet and his wife, the fair and simple Iduna, who gathered the apples that kept age from the dwellers in Asgard. Bragi ceased to tell his never-ending tale. Then one day, overcome by the fear and the foreboding that was creeping through Asgard, Iduna slipped down Yggdrasil, the world tree, and no one was left to pluck the apples with which the Aesir and the Vanir stayed their youth. Then were all the dwellers in Asgard in sore dismay. Strength and beauty began to fade from all. Thor found it hard to lift Mjolnir, his great hammer, and the flesh under Freya's necklace lost its white radiance. And still Gulveig the witch walked smiling through Asgard, although now she was hated by all. It was Odin and Frey who went in search of Iduna. She would have been found and brought back without delay if Frey had had with him the magic sword that he bartered for Gerda. In his search he had to strive with one who guarded the lake wherein Iduna had hidden herself. Beli was the one he strove against. He overcame him in the end with a weapon made of stag's antlers. Ah, it was not then but later that Frey lamented the loss of his sword. It was when the riders of Muspel came against Asgard, and the Vanir, who might have prevailed, prevailed not because of the loss of Frey's sword. They found Iduna and they brought her back. But still care and foreboding crept through Asgard, and it was known, too, that the witch Gulveig was changing the thoughts of the gods. At last Odin had to judge Gulveig. He judged her and decreed her death. And only Gungnir, the spear of Odin, might slay Gulveig, who was not of mortal race. Odin hurled Gungnir. The spear went through Gulveig, but still she stood smiling at the gods. A second time Odin hurled his spear. A second time Gungnir pierced the witch. She stood livid as one dead, but fell not down. A third time Odin hurled his spear, and now, pierced for the third time, the witch gave a scream that made all Asgard shudder, and she fell in death on the ground. "I have slain in these halls where slaying is forbidden," Odin said. "Take now the corpse of Gulveig and burn it on the ramparts, so that no trace of the witch who has troubled us will remain in Asgard." They brought the corpse of Gulveig the witch out on the ramparts, and they lighted fires under the pile on which they laid her, and they called upon Hraesvelgr to fan up the flame. Hraesvelgr is the giant who on heaven's edge sits in the guise of an eagle, and the winds, it is said, rush down on the earth from his outspreading pinions. Far away was Loki when all this was being done. Often now he went from Asgard, and his journeys were to look upon that wondrous treasure that had passed from the keeping of the dwarf Andvari. It was Gulveig who had kept the imagination of that treasure within his mind. Now, when he came back and heard the whispers of what had been done, a rage flamed up within him. For Loki was one of those whose minds were being changed by the presence and the whispers of the witch Gulveig. His mind was being changed to hatred of the gods. Now he went to the place of Gulveig's burning. All her body was in ashes, but her heart had not been devoured by the flames. And Loki in his rage took the heart of the witch and ate it. Oh, black and direful was it in Asgard the day that Loki ate the heart that the flames would not devour. Chapter 2. Loki the Betrayer. He stole Frigga's dress of falcon feathers. Then, as a falcon, he flew out of Asgard. Jotunheim was the place that he flew toward. The anger and the fierceness of the hawk was within Loki as he flew through the giant's realm. The heights and the chasms of that dread land made his spirits mount up like fire. He saw the whirlpools and the smoking mountains and had joy of these sights. Higher and higher he soared until, looking toward the south, he saw the flaming land of Muspelheim. Higher and higher still he soared. With his falcon's eyes he saw the gleam of Surtur's flaming sword. All the fire of Muspelheim and all the gloom of Jotunheim would one day be brought against Asgard and against Midgard. But Loki was no longer dismayed to think of the ruin of Asgard's beauty and the ruin of Midgard's promise. He hovered around one of the dwellings in Jotunheim. Why had he come to it? Because he had seen two of the women of that dwelling, and the rage against the Asungnir and the Vanir was such that the ugliness and the evil of these women was pleasing to him. He hovered before the open door of the giant's house, and he looked upon those who were within. Gerriod, the most savage of all the giants, was there, and beside him, squatting on the ground, were his two evil and ugly daughters, Gialp and Gripe. They were big and bulky, black and rugged, with horses' teeth and hair that was like horses' manes. Gialp was the uglier of the two, if one could be said to be uglier than the other, for her nose was a yard long, and her eyes were crooked. What were they talking about as they sat there, one scratching the other? Of Asgard and the dwellers in Asgard whom they hated. Thor was the one whom they hated most of all, and they were speaking of all they would like to do to him. "I would keep Thor bound in chains," said Gerriod the giant, "and I would beat him to death with my iron club." "I would grind his bones to powder," said Gripe. "I would tear the flesh off his bones," said Gialp. "Father, can you not catch this Thor and bring him to us alive?" "Not so long as he has his hammer Mjolnir, and the gloves with which he grasps his hammer, and the belt that doubles his strength." "Oh, if we could catch him without his hammer and his belt and his gloves!" cried Gialp and Gripe together. At that moment they saw the falcon hovering before the door. They were eager now for something to hold and torment, and so the hearts of the three became set upon catching the falcon. They did not stir from the place where they were sitting, but they called the child Glap, who was swinging from the roof-tree, and they bade him go out and try to catch the falcon. All concealed by the great leaves, the child Glap climbed up the ivy that was around the door. The falcon came hovering near. Then Glap caught it by the wings and fell down through the ivy, screaming and struggling as he was being beaten and clawed and torn by the wings and the talons and the beak of the falcon. Gerriod and Greip and Gialp rushed out and kept hold of the falcon. As the giant held him in his hands and looked him over, he knew that this was no bird creature. The eyes showed him to be of Alfheim or Asgard. The giant took him and shut him in a box till he would speak. Soon he tapped at the closed box, and when Gerriod opened it, Loki spoke to him. So glad was the savage giant to have one of the dwellers in Asgard in his power that he and his daughters did nothing but laugh and chuckle to each other for days. And all this time they left Loki in the closed box to waste with hunger. When they opened the box again, Loki spoke to them. He told them he would do any injury to the dwellers in Asgard that would please them if they would let him go. "Will you bring Thor to us?" said Greip. "Will you bring Thor to us without his hammer, and without the gloves with which he grasps his hammer, and without his belt?" said Gialp. "I will bring him to you if you will let me go," Loki said. "Thor is easily deceived, and I can bring him to you without his hammer and his belt and his gloves." "We will let you go, Loki," said the giant, "if you will swear by the gloom of Jotunheim that you will bring Thor to us as you say." Loki swore that he would do so by the gloom of Jotunheim. "Yea, and by the fires of Muspelheim," he added. The giant and his daughters let him go, and he flew back to Asgard. He restored to Frigga her falcon dress. All blamed him for having stolen it, but when he told how he had been shut up without food in Gerriod's dwelling, those who judged him thought he had been punished enough for the theft. He spoke as before to the dwellers in Asgard, and the rage and hatred he had against them since he had eaten Gulveig's heart he kept from bursting forth. He talked to Thor of the adventures they had together in Jotunheim. Thor would now roar with laughter when he talked of the time when he went as a bride to Thrym the giant. Loki was able to persuade him to make another journey to Jotunheim. "And I want to speak to you of what I saw in Gerriod's dwelling," he said. "I saw there the hair of Sif, your wife." "The hair of Sif, my wife?" said Thor in surprise. "Yes, the hair I once cut off from Sif's head," said Loki. "Gerriod was the one who found it when I cast it away. They light their hall with Sif's hair. Oh yes, they don't need torches where Sif's hair is." "I should like to see it," said Thor. "Then pay Gerriod a visit," Loki replied. "But if you go to his house you will have to go without your hammer Mjolnir and without your gloves and your belt." "Where will I leave Mjolnir and my gloves and my belt?" Thor asked. "Leave them in Valaskjalf, Odin's own dwelling," said cunning Loki. "Leave them there and come to Gerriod's dwelling. Surely you will be well treated there." "Yes, I will leave them in Valaskjalf and go with you to Gerriod's dwelling," Thor said. Thor left his hammer, his gloves and his belt in Valaskjalf. Then he and Loki went toward Jotunheim. When they were near the end of their journey they came to a wide river, and with a young giant whom they met on the bank they began to ford it. Suddenly the river began to rise. Loki and the young giant would have been swept away, only Thor gripped both of them. Higher and higher the river rose, and rougher it became. Thor had to plant his feet firmly on the bottom, or he and the two he held would have been swept down by the flood. He struggled across, holding Loki and the young giant. A mountain ash grew out of the bank, and while the two held to him, he grasped it with his hands. The river rose still higher, but Thor was able to draw Loki and the young giant to the bank, and then he himself scrambled up on it. Now looking up the river he saw a sight that filled him with rage. A giantess was pouring a flood into it. This it was that was making the river rise and seethe. Thor pulled a rock out of the bank and hurled it at her. It struck her and flung her into the flood. Then she struggled out of the water and went yelping away. This giantess was Gialp, Gerriod's ugly and evil daughter. Nothing would do the young giant whom Thor had helped across but that the pair would go and visit Grid, his mother, who lived in a cave in the hillside. Loki would not go, and was angered to hear that Thor thought of going. But Thor, seeing the giant youth was friendly, was willing enough to go to Grid's dwelling. "Go then, but get soon to Gerriod's dwelling yonder. I will wait for you there," said Loki. He watched Thor go up the hillside to Grid's cave. He waited until he saw Thor come back down the hillside and go toward Gerriod's dwelling. He watched Thor go into the house where, as he thought, death awaited him. Then, in a madness for what he had done, Loki, with his head drawn down on his shoulders, started running like a bird along the ground. Grid, the old giantess, was seated on the floor of the cave grinding corn between two stones. "Who is it?" she said, as her son led Thor within. "One of the Aesir. What giant do you go to injure now, Asa Thor?" "I go to injure no giant, old Grid," Thor replied. "Look upon me. Cannot you see that I have not Mjolnir, my mighty hammer, with me, nor my belt, nor my gloves of iron?" "But where in Jotunheim do you go?" "To the house of a friendly giant, old Grid, to the house of Gerriod." "Gerriod a friendly giant? You are out of your wits, Asa Thor. Is he not out of his wits, my son? This one who saved you from the flood, as you say?" "Tell him of Gerriod, old mother," said the giant youth. "Do not go to his house, Asa Thor. Do not go to his house." "My word has been given, and I should be a craven if I stayed away now, just because an old crone sitting at a quernstone tells me I am going into a trap." "I will give you something that will help you, Asa Thor. Lucky for you I am mistress of magical things. Take this staff in your hands. It is a staff of power, and will stand you in stead of Mjolnir." "I will take it since you offer it in kindness, old dame, this worm-eaten staff." "And take these mittens too. They will serve you for gauntlets of iron." "I will take them since you offer them in kindness, old dame, these worn old mittens." "And take this length of string. It will serve you for your belt of prowess." "I will take it since you offer it in kindness, old dame, this ragged length of string." "'Tis well indeed for you, Asa Thor, that I am mistress of magical things." Thor put the worn length of string around his waist, and as he did he knew that Grid, the old giantess, was indeed the mistress of magical things, for immediately he felt his strength augmented as when he put on his own belt of strength. He then drew on the mittens and took the staff that she gave him in his hands. He left the cave of Grid, the old giantess, and went to Gerriod's dwelling. Loki was not there. It was then that Thor began to think that perhaps old Grid was right and that a trap was being laid for him. No one was in the hall. He came out of the hall and into a great stone chamber, and he saw no one there either. But in the center of the stone chamber there was a stone seat, and Thor went to it and seated himself upon it. No sooner was he seated than the chair flew upwards. Thor would have been crushed against the stone roof, only that he held his staff up. So great was the power in the staff, so great was the strength that the string around him gave, that the chair was thrust downward. The stone chair crashed down upon the stone floor. There were horrible screams from under it. Thor lifted up the seat and saw two ugly broken bodies there. The giant's daughters, Gjalp and Greip, had hidden themselves under the chair to watch his death. But the stone that was to have crushed him against the ceiling had crushed them against the floor. Thor strode out of that chamber with his teeth set hard. A great fire was blazing in the hall, and standing beside that fire he saw Gerriod, the long-armed giant. He held a tongs into the fire. As Thor came toward him he lifted up the tongs and flung from it a blazing wedge of iron. It whizzed straight toward Thor's forehead. Thor put up his hands and caught the blazing wedge of iron between the mittens that old Grid had given him. Quickly he hurled it back at Gerriod. It struck the giant on the forehead and went blazing through him. Gerriod crashed down into the fire, and the burning iron made a blaze all around him. And when Thor reached Grid's cave, he went there to restore to the old giantess the string, the mittens, and the staff of power she had given him. He saw the giant's dwelling in such a blaze that one would think the fires of Muspelheim were all around it. End of section 15. Of the Children of Odin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. The Children of Odin, the Book of Northern Myths, by Padraic Colum. Part 3, Chapter 3. Loki against the Aesir. The Aesir were the guests of the Vanir. In Frey's palace the dwellers in Asgard met and feasted in friendship. Odin and Tyr were there, Vidar and Vali, Njord, Frey, Heimdall and Bragi. The Sinjur and the Vana were also, Frigga, Freya, Iduna, Gerda, Skadi, Sif and Nanna. Thor and Loki were not at the feast, for they had left Asgard together. In Frey's palace the vessels were of shining gold. They made light for the table, and they moved of their own accord to serve those who were feasting. All was peace and friendship there, until Loki entered the feast hall. Frey, smiling a welcome, showed a bench to Loki. It was beside Bragi's and next to Freya's. Loki did not take the place. Instead he shouted out, "Not beside Bragi will I sit, not beside Bragi, the most craven of all the dwellers in Asgard." Bragi sprang up at that affront, but his wife, the mild Iduna, quieted his anger. Freya turned to Loki and reproved him for speaking injurious words at a feast. "Freya," said Loki, "why were you not so mild when Odur was with you? Would it not have been well to have been wifely with your husband, instead of breaking faith with him for the sake of a necklace that you craved of the giant women?" Amazement fell on all at the bitterness that was in Loki's words and looks. Tyr and Njord stood up from their seats. But then the voice of Odin was heard, and all was still for the words of the All-Father. "Take the place beside Vidar, my silent son, O Loki," said Odin, "and let thy tongue which drips bitterness be silent. All the Aesir and the Vanir listen to thy words, O Odin, as if thou wert always wise and just," Loki said. "But must we forget that thou didst bring war into the world when thou didst fling thy spear at the envoys of the Vanir? And didst thou not permit me to work craftily on the one who built the wall around Asgard for a price? Thou dost speak, O Odin, and all the Aesir and the Vanir listen to thee. But was it not thou who, thinking not of wisdom but of gold when a ransom had to be made, brought the witch Gulveig out of the cave where she stayed with the dwarf's treasure? Thou wert not always wise nor always just, O Odin, and we at the table here need not listen to thee as if always thou wert." Then Skadi, the wife of Njord, flung words at Loki. She spoke with all the fierceness of her giant blood. "Why should we not rise up and chase from the hall this chattering crow?" she said. "Skadi," said Loki, "remember that the ransom for thy father's death has not yet been paid. Thou wert glad to snatch a husband instead of it. Remember who it was that killed thy giant father. It was I, Loki, and no ransom have I paid thee for it, although thou hast come amongst us in Asgard." Then Loki fixed his eyes on Frey, the giver of the feast, and all knew that with bitter words he was about to assail him. But Tyr, the brave swordsman, rose up and said, "Not against Frey mayst thou speak, O Loki. Frey is generous. He is the one amongst us who spares the vanquished and frees the captive." "Cease speaking, Tyr," said Loki. "Thou mayst not always have a hand to hold that sword of thine. Remember this saying of mine in days to come." "Frey," said he, "because thou art the giver of the feast they think I will not speak the truth about thee. But I am not to be bribed by a feast. Didst thou not send Skirnir to Gymer's dwelling to befool Gymer's flighty daughter? Didst thou not bribe him into frightening her into a marriage with thee, who, men say, wert the slayer of her brother? Yea, Frey, thou didst part with a charge with the magic sword that thou shouldst have kept for the battle. Thou hadst cause to grieve when thou didst meet Beli by the lake." When he said this, all who were there of the Vanir rose up, their faces threatening Loki. "Sit still, ye Vanir," Loki railed. "If the Aesir are to bear the brunt of Jotunheim's and Muspelheim's war upon Asgard, it was your part to be the first or the last on Vigard's plain. But already ye have lost the battle for Asgard, for the weapon that was put into Frey's hands he bartered for Gerda the giantess. Ha! Surtur shall triumph over you because of Frey's bewitchment." In horror they looked at the one who could let his hatred speak of Surtur's triumph. All would have laid hands on Loki, only Odin's voice rang out. Then another appeared at the entrance of the feasting hall. It was Thor. With his hammer upon his shoulder, his gloves of iron on his hands, and his belt of prowess around him, he stood marking Loki with wrathful eyes. "Ha! Loki, betrayer!" he shouted. "Thou didst plan to leave me dead in Geirrod's house, but now thou wilt meet death by the stroke of this hammer." His hands were raised to hurl Mjolnir, but the words that Odin spoke were heard. "Not in this hall may slaying be done, son Thor. Keep thy hands upon thy hammer." Then, shrinking from the wrath in the eyes of Thor, Loki passed out of the feast hall. He went beyond the walls of Asgard and crossed Bifrost, the rainbow bridge. And he cursed Bifrost, and longed to see the day when the armies of Muspelheim would break it down in their rush against Asgard. East of Midgard there was a place more evil than any region in Jotunheim. It was Jarnvid, the Iron Wood. There dwelt witches who were the most foul of all witches, and they had a queen over them, a hag, mother of many sons who took upon themselves the shape of wolves. Two of her sons were Skoll and Hati, who pursued Sol, the sun, and Mani, the moon. She had a third son, who was Managarm, the wolf who was to be filled with the life-blood of men, who was to swallow up the moon and stain the heavens and earth with blood. To Jarnvid, the Iron Wood, Loki made his way, and he wed one of the witches there, Angerboda, and they had children that took on dread shapes. Loki's offspring were the most terrible of the foes that were to come against the Aesir and the Vanir in the time that was called the Twilight of the Gods. Chapter 4. The Valkyrie. Against the time when the riders of Muspelheim, with the giants and the evil powers of the underworld, would bring on battle, Odin All-Father was preparing a host of defenders for Asgard. They were not of the Aesir nor of the Vanir. They were of the race of mortal men, heroes chosen from amongst the slain on fields of battle in Midgard. To choose the heroes, and to give victory to those he willed to have victory, Odin had battle maidens that went to the fields of war. Beautiful were those battle maidens and fearless. Wise were they also, for to them Odin showed the runes of wisdom. Valkyries, choosers of the slain, they were named. Those who were chosen on the fields of the slain were called in Asgard the Einherjar. For them Odin made ready a great hall. Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain, it was called. 540 doors had Valhalla, and out of each door 800 champions might pass. Every day the champions put on their armor and took their weapons down from the walls and went forth and battled with each other. All who were wounded were made whole again, and in peace and goodly fellowship they sat down to the feast that Odin prepared for them. Odin himself sat with his champions, drinking wine but eating no meat. For meat the champions ate the flesh of the boar Sirimnir. Every day the boar was killed and cooked, and every morning it was whole again. For drink they had the mead that was made from the milk of the goat Heidrun, the goat that browsed on the leaves of the tree Lyradir. And the Valkyries, the wise and fearless battle maidens, went amongst them, filling up the drinking horns with the heady mead. Youngest of all the battle maidens was Brynhild. Nevertheless, to her Odin All-Father had shown more of the runes of wisdom than he had shown to any of her sisters. And when the time came for Brynhild to journey down into Midgard, he gave her a swan-feather dress, such as he had given before to the 3 Valkyrie sisters, Alvit, Olrun, and Hladgrun. In the dazzling plumage of a swan the young battle-maiden flew down from Asgard. Not yet had she to go to the battlefields. Waters drew her, and as she waited on the will of the All-Father, she sought out a lake that had golden sands for its shore, and as a maiden bathed in it. Now there dwelt near this lake a young hero whose name was Agnar. And one day as Agnar lay by the lake, he saw a swan with dazzling plumage fly down to it. And while she was in the reeds the swan-feather dress slipped off her, and Agnar beheld the swan change to a maiden. So bright was her hair, so strong and swift were all her movements, that he knew her for one of Odin's battle maidens, for one of those who give victory and choose the slain. Very daring was Agnar, and he set his mind upon capturing this battle-maiden, even though he should bring on himself the wrath of Odin by doing it. He hid the swan-feather dress that she had left in the reeds. When she came out of the water she might not fly away. Agnar gave back to her the swan-feather dress, but she had to promise that she would be his battle-maiden. And as they talked together, the young Valkyrie saw in him a hero that one from Asgard might help. Very brave and very noble was Agnar. Brynhild went with him as his battle-maiden, and she told him much from the runes of wisdom that she knew, and she showed him that the All-Father's last hope was in the bravery of the heroes of the earth. With the chosen from the slain for his champions, he would make battle in defense of Asgard. Always Brynhild was with Agnar's battalions. Above the battles she hovered, her bright hair and flashing battle-dress outshining the spears and swords and shields of the warriors. But the grey-beard King Helmgunnar made war on the young Agnar. Odin favored the grey-beard king, and to him he promised the victory. Brynhild knew the will of the All-Father, but to Agnar, not to Helmgunnar, she gave the victory. Doomed was Brynhild on the instant she went against Odin's will. Never again might she come into Asgard. A mortal woman she was now, and the Norns began to spin the thread of her mortal destiny. Sorrowful was Odin All-Father that the wisest of his battle-maidens might never appear in Asgard, nor walk by the benches at the feasts of his champions in Valhalla. He rode down on Sleipnir to where Brynhild was, and when he came before her, it was his and not her head that was bowed down. For she knew now that the world of men was paying a bitter price for the strength that Asgard would have in the last battle. The bravest and noblest were being taken from Midgard to fill up the ranks of Odin's champions. And Brynhild's heart was full of anger against the rulers of Asgard, and she cared no more to be of them. Odin looked on his unflinching battle-maiden, and he said, "Is there aught thou wouldst have me bestow on thee in thy mortal life, Brynhild?" "Naught save this," Brynhild answered, "that in my mortal life no one but a man without fear, the bravest hero in the world, may claim me for wife." All-Father bowed his head in thought. "It shall be as thou hast asked," he said. "Only he who is without fear shall come near thee." Then on the top of the mountain that is called Hindfell he had a hall built that faced the south. 10 dwarfs built it of black stone, and when the hall was built he put round it a wall of mounting and circling fire. More did Odin All-Father. He took a thorn of the tree of sleep, and he put it into the flesh of the battle-maiden. Then with her helmet on her head, and the breastmail of the Valkyrie upon her, he lifted Brynhild in his arms and carried her through the wall of mounting and circling fire. He laid her upon the couch that was within the hall. There she would lie in slumber until the hero who was without fear should ride through the flame and waken her to the life of a mortal woman. He took farewell of her, and he rode back to Asgard on Sleipnir. He might not foresee what fate would be hers as a mortal woman. But the fire he had left went mounting and circling around the hall that the dwarfs had built. For ages that fire would be a fence around where Brynhild, once a Valkyrie, lay in sleep. End of section 16.
Of the Children of Odin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. The Children of Odin, the Book of Northern Myths, by Padraic Colum. Part 3, Chapter 5. The Children of Loki. The children of Loki and the witch Angerboda were not as the children of men. They were formless as water, or air, or fire is formless, but it was given to each of them to take on the form that was most like to their own greed. Now the dwellers in Asgard knew that these powers of evil had been born into the world, and they thought it well that they should take on forms and appear before them in Asgard. So they sent one to Yarnvid, the Iron Wood, bidding Loki bring before the gods the powers born of him and the witch Angerboda. So Loki came into Asgard once more, and his offspring took on forms and showed themselves to the gods. The first, whose greed was destruction,
showed himself as a fearful wolf. Fenrir he was named. And the second, whose greed was slow destruction, showed itself as a serpent. Jormungand it was called. The third, whose greed was for withering of all life, took on a form also. When the gods saw it they were affrighted. For this had the form of a woman, and one side of her was that of a living woman, and the other side of her was that of a corpse. Fear ran through Asgard as this form was revealed, and as the name that went with it, Hela, was uttered. Far out of sight of the gods Hela was thrust. Odin took her and hurled her down to the deeps that are below the world. He cast her down to Niflheim, where she took to herself power over the 9 regions. There, in the place that is lowest of all, Hela reigns. Her hall is Elvidnir. It is set round with high walls, and it has barred gates. Precipice is the threshold of that hall, hunger is the table within it, care is the bed, and burning anguish is the hanging of the chamber. Thor laid hold upon Jormungand. He flung the serpent into the ocean that engirdles the world. But in the depths of the ocean Jormungand flourished. It grew and grew until it encircled the whole world, and men knew it as the Midgard serpent. Fenrir the wolf might not be seized upon by any of the Aesir. Fearfully he ranged through Asgard, and they were only able to bring him to the outer courts by promising to give him all the food he was able to eat. The Aesir shrank from feeding Fenrir, but Tyr, the brave swordsman, was willing to bring food to the wolf's lair. Every day he brought him huge provision and fed him with the point of his sword. The wolf grew and grew until he became monstrous and a terror in the minds of the dwellers in Asgard. At last the gods in council considered it and decided that Fenrir must be bound. The chain that they would bind him with was called leading. In their own smithy the gods made it, and its weight was greater than Thor's hammer. Not by force could the gods get the fetter upon Fenrir, so they sent Skirnir, the servant of Frey, to beguile the wolf into letting it go upon him. Skirnir came to his lair and stood near him, and he was dwarfed by the wolf's monstrous size. "How great may thy strength be, mighty one?" Skirnir asked. "Couldst thou break this chain easily? The gods would try thee." In scorn Fenrir looked down on the fetter Skirnir dragged. In scorn he stood still, allowing leading to be placed upon him. Then, with an effort that was the least part of his strength, he stretched himself and broke the chain in 2. The gods were dismayed, but they took more iron, and with greater fires and mightier hammer blows they forged another fetter. Dromi this one was called, and it was half again as strong as leading was. Skirnir the venturesome brought it to the wolf's lair, and in scorn Fenrir let the mightier chain be placed upon him. He shook himself, and the chain held. Then his eyes became fiery, and he stretched himself with a growl and a snarl. Dromi broke across, and Fenrir stood looking balefully at Skirnir. The gods saw that no chain they could forge would bind Fenrir, and they fell more and more into fear of him. They took counsel again, and they bethought them of the wonder work the dwarfs had made for them, the spear Gungnir, the ship Skidbladnir, the hammer Mjolnir. Could the dwarfs be got to make the fetter to bind Fenrir? If they would do it, the gods would add to their domain. Skirnir went down to Svartheim with the message from Asgard. The dwarf chiefs swelled with pride to think that it was left to them to make the fetter that would bind Fenrir. "We dwarfs can make a fetter that will bind the wolf," he said. "Out of 6 things we will make it." "What are these 6 things?" Skirnir asked. "The roots of stones, the breath of a fish, the beards of women, the noise made by the footfalls of cats, the sinews of bears, the spittle of a bird." "I have never heard the noise made by a cat's footfall, nor have I seen the roots of stones, nor the beards of women. But use what things you will, O helper of the gods." The chief brought his 6 things together, and the dwarfs in their smithy worked for days and nights. They forged a fetter that was named Gleipnir. Smooth and soft as a silken string it was. Skirnir brought it to Asgard and put it into the hands of the gods. Then a day came when the gods said that once again they should try to put a fetter upon Fenrir. But if he was to be bound, they would bind him far from Asgard. Lyngvi was an island that they often went to make sport, and they spoke of going there. Fenrir growled that he would go with them. He came and he sported in his own terrible way. And then, as if it were to make more sport, one of the Aesir shook out the smooth cord and showed it to Fenrir. "It is stronger than you might think, mighty one," they said. "Will you not let it go upon you, that we may see you break it?" Fenrir out of his fiery eyes looked scorn upon them. "What fame would there be for me," he said, "in breaking such a binding?" They showed him that none in their company might break it, slender as it was. "Thou only art able to break it, mighty one," they said. "The cord is slender, but there may be an enchantment in it," Fenrir said. "Thou canst not break it, Fenrir, and we need not dread thee any more," the gods said. Then was the wolf ravenous wroth, for he lived on the fear that he made in the minds of the gods. "I am loath to have this binding upon me," he said, "but if one of the Aesir will put his hand in my mouth as a pledge that I shall be freed of it, I will let ye put it on me." The gods looked wistfully at one another. It would be health to them all to have Fenrir bound, but who would lose his hand to have it done? One and then another of the Aesir stepped backward, but not Tyr, the brave swordsman. He stepped to Fenrir and laid his left hand before those tremendous jaws. "Not thy left hand, thy sword hand, O Tyr," growled Fenrir, and Tyr put his sword hand into that terrible mouth. Then the cord Gleipnir was put upon Fenrir. With fiery eyes he watched the gods bind him. When the binding was on him, he stretched himself as before. He stretched himself to a monstrous size, but the binding did not break off him. Then with a fury he snapped his jaws upon the hand, and Tyr's hand, the swordsman's hand, was torn off. But Fenrir was bound. They fixed a mighty chain to the fetter, and they passed the chain through a hole they bored through a great rock. The monstrous wolf made terrible efforts to break loose, but the rock and the chain and the fetter held. Then, seeing him secured, and to avenge the loss of Tyr's hand, the gods took Tyr's sword and drove it to the hilt through his underjaw. Horribly the wolf howled. Mightily the foam flowed down from his jaws. The foam flowing made a river that is called Von, a river of fury that flowed on until Ragnarok came, the twilight of the gods. End of section 17. Children of Odin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. The Children of Odin, the Book of Northern Myths, by Padraic Colum. Part 3, Chapter 6. Baldor's Doom. In Asgard there were two places that meant strength and joy to the Aesir and the Vanir. One was the garden where grew the apples that Iduna gathered, and the other was the peace stead, where in a palace called Breidablik Baldur the well-beloved dwelt. In the peace stead no crime had ever been committed, no blood had ever been shed, no falseness had ever been spoken. Contentment came into the minds of all in Asgard when they thought upon this place. Ah, were it not that the peace stead was there, happy with Baldur's presence, the minds of the Aesir and the Vanir might have become gloomy and stern, from thinking on the direful things that were arrayed against them. Baldur was beautiful. So beautiful was he that all the white blossoms on the earth were called by his name. Baldur was happy. So happy was he that all the birds on the earth sang his name. So just and so wise was Baldur that the judgment he pronounced might never be altered. Nothing foul or unclean had ever come near where he had his dwelling. 'Tis Breidablik called, where Baldur the Fair hath built him a bower, in the land where I know least loathliness lies. Healing things were done in Baldur's stead. Tyr's wrist was healed of the wounds that Fenrir's fangs had made, and there Frey's mind became less troubled with the foreboding that Loki had filled it with when he railed at him about the bartering of his sword. Now, after Fenrir had been bound to the rock in the faraway island, the Aesir and the Vanir knew a while of contentment. They passed bright days in Baldur's stead, listening to the birds that made music there. and it was there that Bragi the poet wove into his never-ending story the tale of Thor's adventures amongst the giants. But even into Baldur's stead foreboding came. One day little Hnossa, the child of Freya and the lost Odur, was brought there in such sorrow that no one outside could comfort her. Nanna, Baldur's gentle wife, took the child upon her lap and found ways of soothing her. Then Hnossa told of a dream that had filled her with fright. She had dreamt of Hela, the queen that is half living woman and half corpse. In her dream Hela had come into Asgard, saying, "A lord of the Aesir I must have to dwell with me in my realm below the earth." Hnossa had such fear from this dream that she had fallen into a deep sorrow. A silence fell upon all when the dream of Hnossa was told. Nanna looked wistfully at Odin All-Father, and Odin, looking at Frigga, saw that a fear had entered her breast. He left the peace-stead and went to his watch-tower, Hlidskjalf. He waited there till Hugin and Munid should come to him. Every day his 2 ravens flew through the world, and coming back to him told him of all that was happening. And now they might tell him of happenings that would let him guess if Hela had indeed turned her thoughts toward Asgard, or if she had the power to draw one down to her dismal abode. The ravens flew to him, and lighting one on each of his shoulders, told him of things that were being said up and down Yggdrasil, the world-tree. Ratatosk the squirrel was saying them, and Ratatosk had heard them from the brood of serpents that with Nidhogg, the great dragon, gnawed ever at the root of Yggdrasil. He told it to the eagle that sat ever on the topmost bough, that in Hela's habitation a bed was spread and a chair was left empty for some lordly comer. And hearing this, Odin thought that it were better that Fenrir the wolf should rage ravenously through Asgard than that Hela should win one from amongst them to fill that chair and lie in that bed. He mounted Sleipnir, his 8-legged steed, and rode down toward the abodes of the dead. For 3 days and 3 nights of silence and darkness he journeyed on. Once one of the hounds of Helheim broke loose and bayed upon Sleipnir's tracks. For a day and night Garm, the hound, pursued them, and Odin smelled the blood that dripped from his monstrous jaws. At last he came to where, wrapped in their shrouds, a field of the dead lay. He dismounted from Sleipnir and called upon one to rise and speak with him. It was on Volva, a dead prophetess, he called. And when he pronounced her name he uttered a rune that had the power to break the sleep of the dead. There was a groaning in the middle of where the shrouded ones lay. Then Odin cried out, "Arise, Volva, prophetess." There was a stir in the middle of where the shrouded ones lay, and a head and shoulders were thrust up from amongst the dead. "Who calls on Volva the prophetess? The rains have drenched my flesh, and the storms have shaken my bones for more seasons than the living know. No living voice has a right to call me from my sleep with the dead." "It is Vegtam the Wanderer who calls. For whom is the bed prepared and the seat left empty in Hela's habitation?" "For Baldur, Odin's son, is the bed prepared and the seat left empty. Now let me go back to my sleep with the dead." But now Odin saw beyond Volva's prophecy. "Who is it," he cried out, "that stands with unbowed head and that will not lament for Baldur? Answer, Volva, prophetess." "Thou seest far, but thou canst not see clearly. Thou art Odin. I can see clearly, but I cannot see far. Now let me go back to my sleep with the dead." "Volva, prophetess," Odin cried out again. But the voice from amongst the shrouded ones said, "Thou canst not wake me any more until the fires of Muspelheim blaze above my head." Then there was silence in the field of the dead, and Odin turned Sleipnir, his steed, and for 4 days, through the gloom and silence, he journeyed back to Asgard. Frigga had felt the fear that Odin had felt. She looked toward Baldur, and the shade of Hela came between her and her son. But then she heard the birds sing in the peace-stead, and she knew that none of all the things in the world would injure Baldur. And to make it sure, she went to all the things that could hurt him, and from each of them she took an oath that it would not injure Baldur, the well-beloved. She took an oath from fire and from water, from iron and from all metals, from earths and stones and great trees, from birds and beasts and creeping things, from poisons and diseases. Very readily they all gave the oath that they would work no injury on Baldur. Then, when Frigga went back and told what she had accomplished, the gloom that had lain on Asgard lifted. Baldur would be spared to them. Hela might have a place prepared in her dark habitation, but neither fire nor water, nor iron nor any metals, nor earths nor stones nor great woods, nor birds nor beasts nor creeping things, nor poisons nor diseases would help her to bring him down. Hela has no arms to draw you to her, the Aesir and the Vanir cried to Baldur. Hope was renewed for them, and they made games to honor Baldur. They had him stand in the peace stead, and they brought against him all the things that had sworn to leave him hurtless. And neither the battle-axe flung full at him, nor the stone out of the sling, nor the burning brand, nor the deluge of water would injure the beloved of Asgard. The Aesir and the Vanir laughed joyously to see these things fall harmlessly from him, while a throng came to join them in the games, dwarfs and friendly giants. But Loki the hater came in with that throng. He watched the games from afar. He saw the missiles and the weapons being flung, and he saw Baldur stand smiling and happy under the strokes of metal and stones and great woods. He wondered at the sight, but he knew that he might not ask the meaning of it from the ones who knew him. He changed his shape into that of an old woman, and he went amongst these who were making sport for Baldur. He spoke to dwarfs and friendly giants. "Go to Frigga and ask. Go to Frigga and ask," was all the answer Loki got from any of them. Then to Fensalir, Frigga's mansion, Loki went. He told those in the mansion that he was Groa, the old enchantress who was drawing out of Thor's head the fragments of a grindstone that a giant's throw had embedded in it. Frigga knew about Groa, and she praised the enchantress for what she had done. "Many fragments of the great grindstone have I taken out of Thor's head by the charms I know," said the pretended Groa. "Thor was so grateful that he brought back to me the husband that he once had carried off to the end of the earth. So overjoyed was I to find my husband restored that I forgot the rest of the charms, and I left some fragments of the stone in Thor's head." So Loki said, repeating a story that was true. "Now I remember the rest of the charm," he said, "and I can draw out the fragments of the stone that are left. But will you not tell me, O Queen, what is the meaning of the extraordinary things I saw the Aesir and the Vanir doing?" "I will tell you," said Frigga, looking kindly and happily at the pretended old woman. "They are hurling all manner of heavy and dangerous things at Baldur, my beloved son, and all Asgard cheers to see that neither metal nor stone nor great wood will hurt him." "But why will they not hurt him?" said the pretended enchantress. "Because I have drawn an oath from all dangerous and threatening things to leave Baldur hurtless," said Frigga. "From all things, lady? Is there no thing in all the world that has not taken an oath to leave Baldur hurtless?" "Well, indeed, there is one thing that has not taken the oath, but that thing is so small and weak that I passed it by without taking thought of it." "What can it be, lady?" "The mistletoe, that is without root or strength. It grows on the eastern side of Valhalla. I passed it by without drawing an oath from it." "Surely you were not wrong to pass it by? What could the mistletoe, the rootless mistletoe, do against Baldur?" Saying this, the pretended enchantress hobbled off. But not far did the pretender go hobbling. He changed his gait and hurried to the eastern side of Valhalla. There a great oak tree flourished, and out of a branch of it a little bush of mistletoe grew. Loki broke off a spray, and with it in his hand he went to where the Aesir and the Vanir were still playing games to honor Baldur. All were laughing as Loki drew near, for the giants and the dwarfs, the Asyniur and the Vana, were all casting missiles. The giants threw too far, and the dwarfs could not throw far enough, while the Asyniur and the Vana threw far and wide of the mark. In the midst of all that glee and gamesomeness it was strange to see one standing joyless. But so he stood, and he was of the Aesir, Hodur, Baldur's blind brother. "Why do you not enter the game?" said Loki to him in his changed voice. "I have no missile to throw at Baldur," Hodur said. "Take this and throw it," said Loki. "It is a twig of the mistletoe." "I cannot see to throw it," said Hodur. "I will guide your hand," said Loki. He put the twig of mistletoe in Hodur's hand, and he guided the hand for the throw. The twig flew toward Baldur. It struck him on the breast, and it pierced him. Then Baldur fell down with a deep groan. The Aesir and the Vanir, the dwarfs and the friendly giants, stood still in doubt and fear and amazement. Loki slipped away, and blind Hodur, from whose hand the twig of mistletoe had gone, stood quiet, not knowing that his throw had bereft Baldur of life. Then a wailing rose around the peace stead. It was from the Asunir and the Vana. Baldur was dead, and they began to lament him. And while they were lamenting him, the beloved of Asgard, Odin, came amongst them. "Hela has won our Baldur from us," Odin said to Frigga as they both bent over the body of their beloved son. "Nay, I will not say it," Frigga said. When the Aesir and the Vanir had won their senses back, the mother of Baldur went amongst them. "Who amongst you would win my love and goodwill?" she said. "Whoever would let him ride down to Hela's dark realm and ask the queen to take ransom for Baldur? It may be she will take it, and let Baldur come back to us. Who amongst you will go? Odin's steed is ready for the journey." Then forth stepped Hermod the Nimble, the brother of Baldur. He mounted Sleipnir and turned the 8-legged steed down toward Hela's dark realm. For 9 days and 9 nights Hermod rode on. His way was through rugged glens, one deeper and darker than the other. He came to the river that is called Gjoll, and to the bridge across it that is all glittering with gold. The pale maid who guards the bridge spoke to him. "The hue of life is still on thee," said Modgudur, the pale maid. "Why dost thou journey down to Hela's deathly realm?" "I am Hermod," he said, "and I go to see if Hela will take ransom for Baldur." "Fearful is Hela's habitation for one to come to," said Modgudur, the pale maid. "All round it is a steep wall that even thy steed might hardly leap. Its threshold is precipice, the bed therein is care, the table is hunger, the hanging of the chamber is burning anguish." "It may be that Hela will take ransom for Baldur." "If all things in the world still lament for Baldur, Hela will have to take ransom and let him go from her," said Modgudur, the pale maid that guards the glittering bridge. "It is well, then, for all things lament Baldur. I will go to her and make her take ransom." "Thou mayst not pass until it is of a surety that all things still lament him. Go back to the world and make sure. If thou dost come to this glittering bridge and tell me that all things still lament Baldur, I will let thee pass, and Hela will have to hearken to thee." "I will come back to thee, and thou, Modgudur, pale maid, will have to let me pass." "Then I will let thee pass," said Modgudur. Joyously Hermod turned Sleipnir and rode back through the rugged glens, each one less gloomy than the other. He reached the upper world, and saw that all things were still lamenting for Baldur. Joyously Hermod rode onward. He met the Vanir in the middle of the world, and he told them the happy tidings. Then Hermod and the Vanir went through the world, seeking out each thing and finding that each thing still wept for Baldur. But one day Hermod came upon a crow that was sitting on the dead branch of a tree. The crow made no lament as he came near. She rose up and flew away, and Hermod followed her to make sure that she lamented for Baldur. He lost sight of her near a cave, and then before the cave he saw a hag with blackened teeth who raised no voice of lament. "If thou art the crow that came flying here, make lament for Baldur," Hermod said. "I, Thaukt, will make no lament for Baldur," the hag said. "Let Hela keep what she holds." "All things weep tears for Baldur," Hermod said. "I will weep dry tears for him," said the hag. She hobbled into her cave, and as Hermod followed, a crow fluttered out. He knew that this was Thaukt, the evil hag, transformed. He followed her, and she went through the world croaking, "Let Hela keep what she holds. Let Hela keep what she holds." Then Hermod knew that he might not ride to Hela's habitation. All things knew that there was one thing in the world that would not lament for Baldur. The Vanir came back to him, and with head bowed over Sleipnir's mane, Hermod rode into Asgard.
Now the Aesir and the Vanir, knowing that no ransom would be taken for Baldur, and that the joy and content of Asgard were gone indeed, made ready his body for the burning. First they covered Baldur's body with a rich robe, and each left beside it his most precious possession. Then they all took leave of him, kissing him upon the brow. But Nanna, his gentle wife, flung herself on his dead breast, and her heart broke, and she died of grief. Then did the Aesir and the Vanir weep afresh. And they took the body of Nanna, and they placed it side by side with Baldur's. On his own great ship, Ringhorn, would Baldur be placed with Nanna beside him. Then the ship would be launched on the water, and all would be burned with fire. But it was found that none of the Aesir or the Vanir were able to launch Baldur's great ship. Hyrroken, a giantess, was sent for. She came mounted on a great wolf with twisted serpents for a bridle. 4 giants held fast the wolf when she alighted. She came to the ship, and with a single push she sent it into the sea. The rollers struck out fire as the ship dashed across them. Then, when it rode the water, fires mounted on the ship, and in the blaze of the fires one was seen bending over the body of Baldur and whispering into his ear. It was Odin All-Father. Then he went down off the ship, and all the fires rose into a mighty burning. Speechlessly the Aesir and the Vanir watched with tears streaming down their faces, while all things lamented, crying, "Baldur the beautiful is dead, is dead." And what was it that Odin All-Father whispered to Baldur as he bent above him, with the flames of the burning ship around? He whispered of a heaven above Asgard that Surtur's flames might not reach, and of a life that would come to beauty again, after the world of men and the world of the gods had been searched through and through with fire. End of Section 18.